The boy who was forced to choose. Can you imagine what it's like to look into the eyes of the person you love most in the world and be forced to destroy them with your own words? It seems impossible, doesn't it? But for a boy of just 7, this wasn't a metaphor. It was a verdict. While other children learned to tie their shoes, he learned to hide secrets that could land someone in prison. While others memorized multiplication tables, he memorized looks, trying to guess if people already knew. And one day the world, with all its bureaucratic coldness, placed him on a stool too high for his feet to reach the ground, and demanded that he speak. Against her, against the mother who made pancakes on Sundays and sang off-key while washing clothes in the sink. Society applauded the act of courage, but no one realized what died inside him that day. Because the world forgets that when a child is forced to tell the truth, sometimes they must sacrifice love to obey justice. And this type of death doesn't make the newspapers, but it continues to scream within the silence of those who survive. Shadows of childhood. The street where he lived looked like something out of an old photograph. Colorful little houses lined up like dominoes, low wooden fences, simple gardens well tended by hands that knew more about earth than time. The morning air always carried the scent of fresh bread from the corner bakery, and the insistent crowing of a neighboring rooster that, for some reason, crowed at all hours of the day. The town was small enough that every sigh became a comment at the grocery store, but large enough that no one really knew what went on behind those closed doors. In that yellow house with its peeling blue windows lived he, a little boy with curious eyes and a light step, and his mother, who seemed to carry the sun in her arms and storms in her eyes. He wasn't sure what normal was in a family, but he suspected his was different. When he went to play at his schoolmates' houses, he noticed the laughter was louder. The plates didn't fly during arguments, and the adults didn't have that weary look, like people carrying a secret in their pockets. At home, everything was unpredictable, like a summer storm. Sometimes the day would begin with pancakes and funny stories from his mother's youth. Other times, a spilled glass was enough for the silence to grow heavy and her tears to spring without warning. Like a fine rain on a clear day, he wondered why she cried so much when she thought he wasn't looking. Maybe it was the world's fault, he imagined. Or maybe it was a spell the city wind cast on people as they grew older. Even with this fluctuating climate, he loved her with the blind devotion only children know. He believed his mother had magical powers. She knew when he had a fever just by touching her lips to his forehead, and could transform a simple blanket into a tent for adventures in the backyard. When he woke up startled in the middle of the night, it was the smell of her lap that made him believe everything would be okay. And for that very reason, it was confusing when he saw her break dishes, tear up old letters, or yell at people he didn't even know. Sometimes he thought there were 2 mothers living in the same house, one made of honey, the other of thunder, and that perhaps he would have to learn to guess which one would appear each day. Over time, he became an expert at reading expressions, like someone learning to decipher the sky before it rains. School was his refuge and his torment. Refuge because there he could pretend he was just another kid, running around with a scraped knee and a sweaty shirt. Torment because the others seemed to live in a world he didn't understand. While his classmates recounted family trips, he made up stories of places he'd never been. While they drew houses with smoking chimneys, he drew floating castles in the sky. Perhaps because deep down he wanted to live somewhere that wouldn't fall to pieces. The teacher said he had too much imagination, and he smiled shyly, not revealing that imagination was the only shield he had against reality. On the playground, I preferred to observe others from afar, like someone watching a movie and trying to memorize the dialogue so they could feel like they were part of the story when it was their turn to appear. He spent hours in the backyard after school, creating worlds with twigs, bottle caps, and colored stones he collected from the roadside. Each object became a character. A blue pebble was a knight protecting the kingdom. A piece of wire was a bridge connecting 2 distant worlds, and a broken plastic cup became the helmet of an uninjured hero. In those worlds, no one screamed, no one cried, and no one suddenly disappeared. It was the only place where he felt whole, even if made of imaginary parts. When his mother called him for dinner, he would run with a heavy heart, hoping it would be one of those good days filled with laughter and stories, and not one where the wind seemed to stop just to hear screams echoing through the house. The strangest thing was how she could be so sweet after a storm. All it took was one night of silence for her to emerge the next morning with a tired smile, pancakes piled high, and the radio playing an old song she danced to alone in the kitchen. He watched her with a lump in his throat, unsure if he could trust this new son after the dark night. Children don't understand mental health, trauma, or the injustices of the adult world. All he understood was that he loved his mother and that, somehow, she seemed to fall apart a little more each day. Sometimes he wanted to fix her with duct tape and kind words like he did with his broken toys. But some things, he would learn later, can't be fixed with childlike love. It was on this tightrope that he lived, trying to be light enough not to break it, but strong enough to hold it. Every step around the house was calculated like a tightrope walker on a steel wire. One wrong comment, one untimely noise, and everything could come crashing down. Still, there was love, so much love, and that was what confused his heart, small and tired for his age. How could someone who loved so much hurt so much? This question echoed silently in his thoughts, like the distant toll of a bell no one else heard. He didn't know that this dilemma would be just the first of many to come, and that one day he would be forced to choose between love and truth, even without fully understanding what each meant. And in that small town, where the walls were low and the gazes were high, everyone seemed to know something about everyone else's life except his. It was as if the yellow house were enveloped by a special kind of silence that no one dared cross. But that silence would begin to crack, slowly like the blue paint on the windows, revealing secrets that not even the wind inside could carry without being cut. And the boy, still unable to read properly, would have to decipher words too heavy for a 7-year-old heart. The yellow house had a scent that changed depending on her mood. On good days, it smelled like cornmeal cake and lavender soap. On bad days, it seemed to have the metallic aroma of something broken in the air, even though nothing was out of place. The boy noticed these details like deciphering a secret code, because to him every detail was a warning. The tone of her voice, the way she slammed the closet door, the quickness of her footsteps down the hallway. He learned to read the world's signs before they became a storm. It was a kind of survival not taught in school, but learned with a heavy heart and watchful eyes. She had the most beautiful smile in town, the neighbors said, and perhaps that's why no one believed him when he tried, in words too small, to explain that sometimes she cried for no reason and stared out the window as if waiting for someone to come get her. No one imagined that behind that smile was a woman struggling to stay on her feet. Sometimes, while she washed clothes in the backyard sink, he watched her secretly, and it seemed as if her every movement was an attempt to push away an invisible weight. He didn't know its name. He just felt it. And children, when they feel without understanding, tend to blame themselves. That's how he began to think that perhaps he was the reason for all that sadness. On days when she was well, the world seemed made of cotton. She would wake him with smacking kisses, make him warm milk with cinnamon, and tickle him until he laughed until he sobbed. She told him stories about her childhood, stories about dances in the church shed, about St. John's Day festivities, about the day she received a rag doll sewn by her grandmother. He loved these stories because in them his mother seemed light, as if time hadn't yet left its mark on her. At those times he imagined that maybe, if he tried hard enough, he could turn back time just so she could be like this again forever. But all it took was a phone call, a letter left on the table, or a neighbor staring too long for everything to change. Her eyes grew distant, her voice thin and fragile like a thread about to snap. He stood still, hoping that shadow would pass quickly like the clouds that raced across the small town sky before letting the sun shine back in. Sometimes he wanted to ask what was wrong, but every time he tried, she smiled and said, "Nothing, my love," with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. So he learned to swallow the questions along with his rice dinner, trying to believe that nothing was a sufficient answer. At school, his classmates thought he was shy. In reality, he was just too tired to compete for the noise. He watched others play and wondered what it would be like to live without fear of what might happen when he got home. His teachers said he was intelligent but distracted, and he was. He spent half his time doing math and the other half trying to figure out whether it would be a good or bad day. When the school bell rang, his heart was torn. Part wanted to run to his mother's arms. Part wanted to disappear for a few hours to buy time in case the storm was approaching. Sometimes, as he walked home along the dirt road, he played a secret game. He would hop only in the squares of shadow the trees cast on the ground, pretending the rest of the road was lava. It was his way of making the journey home easier, of convincing himself he was still a child and not a tiny guardian of adult moods. On these walks, he also made silent promises that he would grow up quickly so he could take care of his mother, that he would earn enough money to buy a house where she could smile every day, that he would never leave her alone. He didn't know that the adult world is full of promises that end up broken along the way. The most painful thing was that beneath it all, she truly seemed to love him more than anything in the world. On difficult days, after the screams had stopped and her sobs echoed down the hallway, she would go to his room in the middle of the night, thinking he was asleep, and cover him with the blanket with a care that hurt. She would run her fingers through his hair and whisper an "I'm sorry, my love" that was never meant for him to hear. But he did, and cherish. It was as if her love always came after destruction, like flowers growing in the cracks of concrete, and he, even without understanding, accepted these flowers with a heavy heart and wide eyes, because he knew that the next day there might be no flowers at all. Living in that house was like living inside an ancient song that sometimes soothed and sometimes tore apart. Every wall seemed to hold echoes of laughter and screams mingled together, as if the house itself didn't know who it was. And he, too young to understand the scars of the adult world, thought his mission was to fix everything. He began to work hard at school, to clean his room alone, to say that the food was delicious even when it was burnt, just to see if her smile would return. He carried this burden with the seriousness of someone holding the sky to keep it from falling on them both. Little did he know that he was learning to nullify himself to fit in with the love of others. Over time, the fear stopped feeling like fear. It became routine. He stopped trembling when he heard the door creak, but his body remained rigid as if holding air. He stopped being frightened by the long silences, but he learned to walk softly through them. Children adapt even to chaos, and that's perhaps the saddest part. He didn't think there was anything wrong with living like that. He thought every house had that dense air sometimes, that every mother alternated between gods and earthquakes. Only years later would he understand that this wasn't normal. It was survival disguised as everyday life. And in that small town, where everyone knew the neighbor's dog's name, no one seemed to notice the weight he carried on his small shoulders. Maybe because he was always smiling, always saying, "It's okay." Children who smile too much sometimes hide shattered worlds behind their baby teeth, and he hid it well. So well that even his mother seemed to believe it. But the shadows were there, silent, growing slowly, and when they finally surfaced, they spared no one, not her. Least of all him, because his world was about to fall apart, and he didn't even know yet that he would be forced to choose between protecting the mother he loved and telling the truth the world would demand. At night, when silence engulfed the city and only the insistent cricket outside could be heard, he would lie with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if waiting for answers written there. He wondered what a normal family would be like. Maybe it was the kind in the soap operas his mother watched. Everyone laughing together at the table, arguing only over who would wash the dishes. He dreamed of it silently but didn't dare wish too loudly. He was afraid the world would hear and take away the only thing he had. Her. Even when his chest ached, even when he wanted to run away, the idea of living far from her was like thinking about breathing without air. It was contradictory, and he knew it. But children understand love as if it were etched in fire. No matter how much it hurts, they still hold on to it with both hands. Sometimes solace came in the form of routine. His mother had a special way of combing his hair before school. She would run her fingers slowly through it, untangling each strand as if it were a gesture of magical protection from the world. He liked to pretend it really was, that touch could scare away the monsters that lived in the cracks of the house. There were also the days when she would whistle softly while washing dishes, and the sound would fill the kitchen like a spell of peace. In those moments, he could believe that maybe it was all just a bad phase and that soon their life would return to the way it should have been from the beginning. But soon the tension returned like a cold draft under the door. All it took was someone knocking on the wrong door, or a letter with a courthouse postmark appearing in the mailbox, for her to turn pale as if she'd seen a ghost. At these times, he didn't need explanations. He would just run to the backyard and hide behind the guava tree until the weather cooled. The adult world seemed made of codes he didn't yet understand. Words that made her tremble, names that couldn't be spoken, papers that seemed to weigh tons. All of this was a mystery to him, but he knew they were somehow connected to the sadness that filled her eyes when she thought no one was looking. The small town had a cruel way of observing without seeming to observe. All she had to do was leave the house with puffy eyes for whispers to arise in the butcher's, the pharmacy, the bakery. "She's acting weird," they said. "She's always been a little too sensitive." No one wondered what she was going through alone. No one imagined the effort she made to continue raising that boy with dignity, even with the whole world against her, and he saw it all. He stored away every harsh comment he heard about her and tried, in his own way, to make up for it. He behaved well, helped with the chores, gave tight hugs as if to say, "I'm with you." It was as if he thought his love could serve as armor for her. And perhaps for a time it did. Sometimes he wanted to tell someone everything. His teacher, perhaps, who seemed to genuinely care about him and had that calm way of listening. But then I wondered what would happen if she believed him and decided to help. What if they took him away from home? What if they sent his mother away? Just imagining it made my stomach hurt. So he kept quiet. He swallowed it all like he swallowed the bitter-tasting vitamins his mother insisted he take. Over time, he learned to smile, to mask his fear, to say it's okay with such conviction that he almost believed it. He became an expert at appearing okay, and this was perhaps the first disguise he ever wore, the first of many he would wear. In the late afternoons, she liked to lie on the grass in the backyard and watch the sky change colors, trying to imagine what it would be like to live somewhere else. Maybe a big city where no one knew anyone and no one asked questions. Maybe a place where people could be sad without having to pretend to be happy. Sometimes she fantasized that one day she would grow up, buy a big house with high walls and huge windows and take her mother to live there. There she wouldn't cry at night anymore. There no one would knock on the door with strange papers. There she would dance in the kitchen every day with loud music and a sincere smile. These dreams were her way of staying afloat. Children dream so they don't break. And so the days passed one after the other, simultaneously the same and different. There was love, so much love, but also a silent fear that grew like a vine in the corners of the house. And he, so small, was already beginning to understand that love sometimes comes mixed with pain, and that the two can live together for a long time, without anyone noticing. He didn't yet know, however, that this early learning would come at a price. One day he would be the one who would have to protect his mother from the world, or protect the world from her. But for now he just wanted to be a child. He just wanted tomorrow to be one of those good days. And on that sultry afternoon, as he listened to his mother hum a sad song in the kitchen, he felt a strange pang in his chest, a mixture of fear and foreboding, as if the air knew something he didn't yet. The shadows were lengthening on the wall, and for the first time, he had the feeling they weren't coming from outside, but from inside the house itself, and they were just starting to grow. Love and confusion. It was strange to love someone and at the same time be afraid when that person suddenly changed. The boy didn't yet have the words to explain it, but he felt this contradiction like a knot in his chest that would never untie. His mother could be the sweetest woman in the world in the morning and, by late afternoon, seemed like a shadow of herself, like a house slowly turning off its lights. He was always trying to understand what was changing her this way. If it was something he did, if it was a memory that hurt her, or if the world was truly made of people who changed like the wind. And it left him confused. How could someone so full of love sometimes seem so distant? He liked to watch how her eyes sparkled when they were together in good times. When she laughed, everything about her seemed to light up. Her cheeks flushed, her hands fluttered, her steps became light. It was in those moments that he knew her love was greater than any evil that could exist. But these moments were like shooting stars. They came quickly and were gone before he could make a wish. Soon the sparkle faded and she became very still, staring somewhere other than in the room. On those days he walked on his feet like one walking on glass, afraid that a single wrong sound would shatter her before him. The most painful thing was that, even on bad days, he continued to love her with that illogical devotion only children know. Childlike love has no instruction manual. It comes with no safety clauses, no off button when it hurts. It's love that persists. He thought that if he loved her enough, he could cure her. So he drew pictures for her, stuck notes on her mirror saying, "You're the best mother in the world," and worked hard to get good grades just to see her smile proudly. Sometimes it worked, sometimes the smile returned, if only for a few minutes. And in those minutes he believed he was saving them both. But this love was always mixed with a small, silent fear that he hid even from himself. He was afraid of making a mistake, of disappointing her, of saying something that would unintentionally upset her. Children who grow up trying to protect adults end up forgetting that they need to be protected too. He didn't know this yet, of course. He only knew that he wanted to see her happy, even if it cost him his own peace. So he molded himself like clay to fit her mood. When she was happy, he laughed loudly. When she was sad, he turned into a shadow. And this cycle of light and shadow gradually became the normal way of life, even if normal there held little peace. The biggest confusion arose because no one outside the house seemed to notice. To the neighbors, she was a charming, dedicated, and kind woman. To his schoolmates, he was just a shy, sweet boy. It was as if they were living a play where only they knew the true script. This contradiction made everything heavier. If the whole world thought she was perfect, then the problem must be with him. It must be him who didn't know how to love her properly, and so he began to carry the guilt like a stone in his pocket, small but ever present, weighing down every step. In good times, the two seemed made for each other. They'd have picnics in the backyard, sing silly songs while washing dishes, and he'd cuddle in her lap, listening to stories about when she was too young to know the world could be cruel. She'd tell him about old dreams. She wanted to be a ballerina, a singer, or maybe hitchhike across the country just to see the ocean. Her eyes would shine with those stories, and he'd imagine what life would be like if those dreams had come true. Maybe, he thought, if he could help her achieve even one of them, she'd smile forever again. But all it took was for something to remind his mother of the real world, for dreams to vanish into thin air. An unexpected phone call, a forgotten request, a snide comment from someone on the street, and the glow vanished as if it had never existed. In those moments, the boy would curl up in silence, waiting for the storm to pass. He learned that her love came with cracks, and that if he wasn't careful, he could cut himself. Still, he kept trying to hold on, even though he was bleeding inside, because for him, letting go of that love would be like letting go of the ground itself. And he didn't know how to walk without ground. This confusion between love and fear began to invade even his dreams. Sometimes he dreamed that she held him tightly and promised everything would be okay. Other times he dreamed that she disappeared and he was left alone in the empty house, calling for her without an answer. He would wake up sweaty, his heart racing, and run to her room just to see if she was still there. When he saw that she was, he breathed a sigh of relief and lay down on the floor beside her bed, like a silent watchman. He wanted to protect her even in his sleep. Children who love too much try to be heroes too soon. And heroes, he would later learn, also get tired. The world seemed split in two, the side where she smiled and the side where she fell apart. And he was always in the middle, trying to glue the pieces back together without letting anyone see the cracks. He began to lie for her, saying she was fine when she wasn't, that she was busy when she was crying, that she was tired when she was broken. He thought that was how you loved someone, hiding the ugly parts so the world wouldn't hurt them anymore. Little did he know that by hiding those parts of her, he was also starting to hide his own. And the more he loved her, the more confused he became. Because love, he was beginning to realize, shouldn't hurt like this. But how could it be wrong to love the one who gave him life? How could he choose between caring for her and caring for himself if he didn't even know who he was yet? These questions spun around in his head like tops, never stopping. And even without answers, he kept trying to save her, trying to understand her, trying not to let her lose herself to the world. Little did he know that in the process he was beginning to lose himself. The boy didn't know it yet. But this confusion between love and fear would be the breeding ground for the greatest pains of his life. And soon, long before his time was right, the world would tear him from that ground by force, demanding that he make the choice no child should have to make. He began to develop a curious kind of silent vigilance. It was as if he had an invisible radar, always active, picking up subtle changes in her tone of voice, her gait, even the way she breathed. If she sighed deeply, he knew to turn down the television. If her brows furrowed even for a second, he'd wipe away his smile and slip into the bedroom. He became an expert at predicting storms, not from the sky but from her soul, and it was this ability that left him even more confused. Loving someone shouldn't mean being constantly on alert, but he didn't know how to live any other way. On good days, she seemed to forget the world could be cruel. They'd go for walks to the square, and she'd buy them both cotton candy even when money was tight. She'd tell funny stories about her time as the school quad queen, and he'd laugh so hard his stomach hurt. At those times, she'd think maybe everything would get better, that the bad days were behind her. that their love was strong enough to banish any shadow. But the problem with shadows is that they don't need an invitation to return. And when they did, they brought a chill that not even her hugs could dispel. This alternation between sweetness and pain began to mess with his understanding of the world. Sometimes he thought that was exactly what love was, holding on tight even when it hurt, smiling even when he felt like disappearing. And that was dangerous because he began to think it was normal to deny himself to see his mother well. If he was tired, he didn't say it. If he was sad, he hid it. He learned to smile as a shield, to say "I'm fine" even when he wasn't. Children who learn too early to hide their feelings end up growing up afraid to feel. But he didn't know that. He only knew that he wanted her to be well, even if it cost him every bit of himself. He also began to confuse guilt with responsibility. When she was sad, he thought it was because she'd done something wrong. If he got a bad grade, he was sure it would weigh heavily on her shoulders. If he fell and hurt his knee, he'd start crying, feeling like he was giving too much trouble. And so, little by little, he learned not to cry, not to complain, not to ask for a cuddle, as if loving meant not bothering. This made him seem too mature for his age, and adults would praise him. What a well-behaved boy, so focused, so calm. They didn't know that his behavior was just fear disguised as calm, that his tranquility was just a cover for a heart at war, and behind it all the immense, desperate, visceral love remained. He wanted to believe that all it took was loving enough to heal her cracks. So he began performing little secret rituals, like spells to protect her. He collected the best stones he found on the street and placed them under her pillow, believing they would bring good luck. He made silent promises every night before bed, swearing he would never leave her alone, and when he saw a shooting star, he would close his eyes and pray with all his 7-year-old heart that the next day would be good for her. It was the kind of faith only children have, the kind that believes love can save the whole world. Love can save the whole world. But the more he tried to protect her, the more his fear grew. Because deep down he knew he had no power. He was just a boy trying to hold the world in his 2 small hands. And this silent fear began to turn into anxiety. Sometimes he would wake before sunrise, his heart racing and the feeling that something bad was going to happen. He would lie still, listening for her breathing in the next room just to be sure she was still there. When he couldn't hear it, he would hold his own breath in fear. Children shouldn't live with that kind of dread, but he did. The most confusing thing was that even after the storms, she remained his favorite person in the world. She remained the lap he craved when his knee scraped, the smile he sought in the audience at school, the voice he longed to hear before falling asleep. This duality tore him apart. How could he be afraid of the one he loved most? How could he want to run away and at the same time never want to leave? Love and fear were so intertwined that he no longer knew where one began and the other ended. It was like trying to separate water from sand with his hands. Impossible. He began to think the problem was with him. Maybe he was a bad son, he thought. Maybe there was a right way to be a son and he was failing. So he tried harder. He tried to guess what she wanted before she even said it. He obeyed without question. He praised everything she did, even when he didn't like it. He wanted to be perfect. He wanted to be light enough so she wouldn't fall apart, strong enough to hold her upright. But the more he tried, the more he felt himself disappearing. It was as if little by little he was becoming a mirror. He reflected her moods, her desires, her fears, and he barely knew who he was anymore. This confusion began to create a silent emptiness inside. Not a sad emptiness, but a confused emptiness, like when you forget the name of something that was always there. Sometimes I'd look in the mirror and not recognize the tired look I saw. I was only 7 years old, but I felt like I was carrying a whole life on my shoulders. I wanted to be able to play without fear, laugh without worry, sleep without hearing the breathing from the other room to be sure the world hadn't ended overnight. I wanted to just be a child, but I no longer knew how to do that. And unbeknownst to him, this tangle of love and fear was paving the way for what was to come. Because one day, long before his time, he would be ripped from this place of sun and thrust into the place of witness, and he would have to look into the eyes of the person he loved most in the world and say words that could destroy her, words he could never forget. The neighborhood whispers in. The small town, nothing went unnoticed. It was the kind of place where all it took was someone changing the color of the curtains to become the talk of the town in the bakery line. The boy, even at a young age, already knew this. He knew that every sidelong glance, every hushed whisper, and every sudden pause in conversation as he or his mother passed by on the street meant something. He just didn't know exactly what. But he felt. And feeling, sometimes, hurt more than understanding, because people's silence could hurt as much as the words left unsaid. It all started with looks he didn't understand. At first he thought people were just distracted, but over time he realized otherwise. They were looking at her, and then at him, with a strange look as if they were watching a show he hadn't yet realized existed. At the grocery store, the women spoke softly and giggled in corners, and when she approached, their smiles faded. At the pharmacy, the clerk, who had previously given him mints, began to hurriedly avoid them. The boy didn't understand. If his mother was so good, so loving, so full of light on good days, why did the world seem to treat her as if she were made of shadows? This doubt began to grow inside him like a weed. Sometimes he pretended to be distracted just to hear what the adults were saying. He discovered that adults talk more when they think the children aren't listening. He heard words like accusation, problems, inquiry, words too big for his small head. He didn't know exactly what they meant, but the tone in which they were said was enough to tighten his stomach. It was a tone of fear and judgment, like teachers when someone breaks something important. And yet, when he came home, she greeted him with hugs and the smell of warm cake as if nothing were wrong. This made everything more confusing. Who was lying, the world or her? He began to notice subtle changes in the way she walked around town. Before, she'd greet everyone on the street enthusiastically. Now she'd lower her eyes, quicken her pace, and pretend not to see. When someone waved from afar, her smile seemed more automatic than sincere. He noticed these things. Children perceive much more than adults realize. And inside, he felt a strange fear. A fear that she was slowly disappearing, not from the world, but from the people. It was as if the neighborhood were erasing her existence with its stares, and he didn't know how to fight back against those stares. At school, the whispers began to reach him too. First, in the form of innocent curiosity. Is it true your mom's leaving? Then in the form of mockery. My mom said yours is going to jail. He didn't quite understand what they meant, but he knew it was bad from the way they laughed. He tried to laugh along to appear unconcerned, but inside, each word felt like a thorn he swallowed in silence. Sometimes he hid in the bathroom, until recess ended, just to avoid having to hear anything else. The problem was the silence of the bathroom hurt too. In him, his thoughts screamed louder. He began to carry a shame he couldn't name. Shame for her? Shame for you? Shame for not knowing what was true? I didn't know. All I knew was that I was walking with my shoulders hunched and my eyes downcast, trying to shrink into nothingness. When adults praised him for being so quiet, he didn't know whether to smile or cry. He wasn't quiet by choice. He was quiet because every word felt dangerous. It was as if I were walking on a glass floor, and any wrong word could bring everything crashing down. And the most confusing thing was that at home, she remained the same mother she'd always been, or at least she tried to be. She made jokes, sang loudly while washing the dishes, made pancakes on weekends. But every now and then, he'd catch her standing at the window motionless, her eyes red and her entire body tense, as if holding the world together to keep it from falling. When he entered the room, she'd quickly wipe her eyes and smile. And that smile, which had once warmed him, now felt like a poorly placed bandage over a deep wound. He smiled back, pretending to believe her. It was the silent game they both played, pretending everything was okay, even when the whole world seemed to say otherwise. The gossip spread like smoke, thin but suffocating. The small town seemed made for this. Everything echoed, everything grew, everything became a story. The baker told the seamstress, who told the neighbor, who told the teacher, and in the end, no one knew what was true anymore. They only knew that something had happened, and the boy began to believe that he too was part of that something, even without knowing what it was. He began to think that perhaps he was the cause of her suffering. After all, if everyone looked at her with suspicion and he was the only thing she had, perhaps he was the weight weighing her down. This idea began to take root deeply, so much so that he began trying to compensate in every way. He tidied the house, did his homework perfectly, and avoided any behavior that might cause trouble. If she was tired, he made jokes. If she was sad, he tried hard not to cry, even if his chest hurt. Children surrounded by judgment strive to be perfect to prove to the world that their mothers aren't monsters, and that was exactly what he tried to do, to be living proof that she was good. But this constant attempt exhausted him, like a soldier always on guard. The neighborhood began to feel hostile. The streets that were once the scene of adventure became paths of judgment. Every corner seemed to have eyes. Every window seemed to whisper. When I walked with her to the market, I felt their gazes burning into my skin. And yet I held her hand tighter, as if silently saying to the world, "She's mine. Don't touch her." It was an instinctive defense, like a puppy rushing to its wounded mother. And paradoxical as it was, this impulse to protect her grew alongside my fear of what they were saying about her. At night, the whispers echoed in his head as if trapped inside his pillow. Accusation. Trouble. Prey. Words he didn't understand, but which held a strong hold. He tried to push them away by making up stories in his mind. He imagined his mother was a heroine in disguise, pretending to be an ordinary woman while in fact saving the world in secret. Maybe, he thought, the neighbors were just jealous. Maybe they couldn't stand seeing someone so strong and so sweet at the same time. It was a beautiful lie, and for a while, it helped. Until the whispers came back louder, reminding him that the real world didn't believe in heroines. And it was in this stew of gossip and love that he began to tear himself apart. He no longer knew what to believe. He loved his mother with every cell in his body, but he was beginning to doubt the whole world, and consequently himself. If everyone was saying something was wrong, maybe there really was. Maybe the wrong thing was that he couldn't see it. Maybe he was blinded by love. This doubt gnawed at him silently, like termites hidden inside the wood, slowly eating away at everything he thought was true. He didn't know it yet, but those whispers would be the frame for the cruelest day of his life, the day he would have to look into her eyes in front of everyone and say things that would tear her heart apart. As the days passed, the whispers grew bolder. They were no longer just muffled whispers on the street corner. They became loose phrases that pierced the air like pebbles thrown from afar. "That poor child," he heard once as he left the grocery store. He couldn't understand if they felt sorry for him because he was her son or sorry for her because she was his mother. But somehow both thoughts stung. Another afternoon, as they sat on a park bench eating bread and dulce de leche, two young men passed by and one said, "That's her," without looking directly at her, but with a crooked smile he would never forget. That stayed stuck in his head for days, like an echo he couldn't silence. The worst part was that no one explained anything. Adults seemed to prefer half words to whole truths, as if the truth were too poisonous to touch. But children sense the poison too, even when they don't see the snake. He could see it in their eyes, in the way people took a half step back when it approached, in the hands that stopped gesturing and slowly lowered, as if hiding something. And that made him shrink back too, even without meaning to, as if the crooked look aimed at her might hit him reflexively. It was a kind of inherited shame, and he wore it without knowing how to remove it. This atmosphere began to isolate the two. Before, neighbors would knock on the door with cake containers. Now, they just left plates at the gate like feeding a skittish dog. The birthday party invitations stopped arriving. At school, the other children's parents began picking them up early, always casting a final glance at him and his mother, a look that wasn't hate or fear, it was worse. Distrust. And distrust, he would later learn, slowly kills affection. His mother noticed all this, of course, but pretended not to. He made forced comments about how they were more relaxed now, just the two of us, and smiled. But her smile seemed increasingly like glass, brilliant, beautiful, and on the verge of shattering. For the boy, that distance was like a mist descending over the city. Things were still there, the square, the neighbors, the sound of the church bells at noon, but everything seemed distant, as if he were observing them through thick glass. The city that had once been his backyard became a foreign place, full of invisible traps. Even the walk to school seemed longer, as if the cobblestones were trying to push him back home. And deep down, he knew it wasn't his imagination. The small town, which had once felt like an embrace, now felt like a silent judge. He then began to create a kind of parallel story about them, to cope with reality. He told himself they were different because they were special, that they didn't participate in parties or sidewalk chats because they were adventurers, like the characters in the books he snuck out of the school library. In these stories he invented, his mother wasn't accused of anything. She was a secret agent living in hiding until the right moment to reveal her heroic mission. And he was her partner. They had to endure the world's distrust because they were saving the world in secret. This fantasy helped him breathe easier for a few hours, until the eyes of real life returned and tore the story apart like strong winds tearing leaves from a tree. One afternoon, as he was returning from school, he heard two neighbors talking behind the backyard fence. They hadn't seen him approach. She should have run away before they let it get to this, one said. Now she's going to drag the boy down with her, the other replied with a heavy sigh. He stood there hidden behind the guava tree, his entire body throbbing as if he'd fallen. Drag the boy down with her. Those 4 words settled on him like rust. For the first time he became afraid not only of what they said about her, but of what they said about him. Did the world see him as some kind of extension of her? Was he, in the eyes of others, also wrong simply for loving her? This idea grew like a shadow in his heart. He began to distance himself from his schoolmates for fear of contaminating them with that invisible stain he believed he had inherited. He avoided playing, avoided conversations, avoided any new relationships because deep down, he believed everyone would eventually distance themselves from him anyway, as the neighbors were doing to his mother. It was easier to move away first than to be left behind. And little by little, the boy who once filled the yard with stories and laughter became silent, withdrawn, his eyes always searching for signs of danger, where before he saw only possibilities. The cruelest thing was that she tried to protect him from all this. But she did it with silence, and her silence sometimes screamed louder than the rumors. When he asked why people were acting strange, she would simply say, "It's just jealousy, my love," and change the subject. But her eyes, deep and restless, told another story. Sometimes he would hear her crying in the bathroom in the early hours of the morning. They weren't loud sobs, they were small, as if even the tears were embarrassed to come out. He would curl up in bed and hold his breath to hide, as if that could make her pain disappear. But the sound penetrated the walls, penetrated his chest, and remained trapped there, like a secret I didn't know where to keep. At some point, she began to hate the whispers, not because of what they said, but because of what they did to her. Each new piece of gossip seemed to dim a bit of the sparkle in her eyes, as if they were stealing her light little by little. And contradictory as it was, she began to feel angry at the entire city. Angry at the streets, the windows, the voices. She wanted to scream at everyone, "You don't know her like I do. She makes amazing pancakes. She knows every constellation in the sky. She loves me more than anything in the world." But she didn't scream. She just clenched her fists in her pockets and walked on in silence, her eyes brimming with tears and her head held high, trying to appear strong enough for them both, and it was there, amid the neighborhood murmurs and her desperate embraces, that a new fear was born, the fear that maybe the adults were right. Maybe there really was something wrong with her, and he just couldn't see it because of love. This doubt haunted him like a shadow clinging to his heels. He began to observe her with a strange gaze, trying to find clues that would confirm or deny what they said. But all he saw was the same woman as always, laughing when he made faces, caring for him when he was sick, tucking in his sheets at night. And this only made him more confused. How could someone he loved so much be everything they said? That question kept hammering away at his mind, growing louder and louder, growing more insistent, until one day the world would stop whispering and start screaming, and the boy would be forced to choose who to believe, the entire city, or the mother who was the center of his little universe. When the mask fell that day, the sky felt like a dirty sheet stretched over the city. No breeze, no birdsong, as if even the weather had decided to hold its breath. The boy walked barefoot through the yard, dragging a toy car across the dirt floor while his mother spoke on the phone inside. Her voice was different. It wasn't the sweet voice of kitchen songs, nor the tired voice of late afternoons. It was sharp, quick, like a blade trying to cut through the silence. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, and the tone made something tighten in his chest as if he'd swallowed a stone. He tried to ignore it. Kids are good at this, pretending they don't see, don't hear, don't understand, even when they understand too much. But the classroom door was ajar, and his curiosity overcame his fear. He crept closer, pressing his face against the doorway. His mother paced back and forth, the phone clutched between her shoulder and ear, her fingers drumming nervously on the table. "You can't put it off any longer," she said, her voice low and firm, as if trying to control a hurricane inside. "If he talks, it's all over." The boy didn't know who he was, or what was going to end, but the words stuck in his mind like chewing gum in his hair. Suddenly, she noticed his presence and turned sharply. Her gaze pierced him like a bolt of lightning. It wasn't anger nor fright. It was something he'd never seen before, panic. In a second, she hung up the phone and forced a smile, that glassy smile he was beginning to recognize. "My love, go wash your hands and we'll have dinner soon," she said, her voice too sweet, too false. He nodded but didn't move. Something inside him, a little voice he couldn't quite place, told him this moment was important, that there was a crack opening in the world, and if he blinked, he might fall right into it. At night, lying in bed, the phrase echoed over and over, "If he talks, it's all over." He tried to convince himself he'd misheard, that she was talking about something else, maybe a problem at the bank or an overdue house repair. But the phrase didn't sound like a repair or a bill, it sounded like a secret. And secrets, he knew, were dangerous. His mother always said that people who hide secrets end up heavy inside. And maybe that was why she'd had that hollow look in her eyes lately, as if she were carrying invisible stones in her pockets. For the first time, he felt afraid that maybe the town's whispers weren't just malice. Maybe there was something true there, hidden beneath it all. In the days that followed, he began to observe her with a new, suspicious eye. Like a young detective trying to piece together a puzzle without knowing the final figure. He noticed that she locked her bedroom door every time she left. That she sometimes left in the middle of the night and returned before dawn, smelling of the road and with puffy eyes. That she hid envelopes in the kitchen cabinet and changed the subject every time the phone rang. Things that had previously seemed normal now seemed like clues, and the more he noticed, the more he felt guilty for noticing, as if he were betraying her just by trying to understand. One late afternoon, returning from school, he found his mother sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by papers scattered like autumn leaves. Her face was white, her eyes red, and she tore the papers apart with a strange calm, as if tearing apart her own past. He stood in the doorway, not daring to enter. "Is everything okay?" he asked softly. She looked up, and for a moment he swore she didn't recognize him, as if she were far away, somewhere he couldn't reach. Then she blinked, took a deep breath, and smiled. "Everything's fine, my love." But the smile was only a shell. Inside, he could see she was silently falling apart. It was that night that the mask slipped completely. He woke to voices coming from the kitchen, low and hurried. He peeked down the hallway and saw two men talking to her. They weren't neighbors nor relatives. They wore dark clothes, had serious expressions, and were holding folders. One of them spoke firmly, pointing to a document. His mother listened with her arms crossed and her chin raised like a wall about to crumble. "You need to cooperate. If he talks, we can't protect him anymore." The other added, "They'll call witnesses, including the boy." The boy froze. It was him they were talking about. His head felt light, his heart raced, and suddenly it felt like the ground had dropped out from under him. She realized he was there. The men left quickly, and she stood in the kitchen, motionless, her eyes filled with unshed tears. He wanted to run and hug her, tell her it was all right, that they were going to be okay, but he couldn't move. It was as if he'd discovered the world wasn't made of solid ground. It was made of thin ice, and they were in the middle, about to sink. His mother approached slowly and knelt before him. "Did you hear something?" she asked with a fragile smile. He shook his head, even though he knew it was a lie. She ran her hand through his hair and whispered, "Don't be afraid." But he felt he needed her, very much. After that night, nothing seemed the same. The house that had once been a shelter now felt like a stage where everyone was playing a role. Her every gesture seemed rehearsed, every word weighed before being spoken, and he, who had once wanted to protect her, now didn't know if he should. He began to feel angry at her. A sad, confused kind of anger for having put him in that place of uncertainty. At the same time, he felt guilty for feeling angry. It was as if two different boys lived inside him, One who wanted to hug her and the other who wanted to scream, "Why did you do that?" This silent war left him exhausted, as if he had aged years in a few days. The town's whispers now made sense, and that was what hurt the most, because he'd spent so long believing everyone was wrong that when he saw signs they might be right, he felt as if he'd betrayed his own mother. But he also felt that if he continued to pretend nothing was happening, they might both sink. And for the first time, he seriously considered telling someone. Not to tell her, he would never use that word, but to ask for help. But he didn't know who to turn to. The adults all seemed part of a game he didn't understand, and he was just a boy, with hands too small to hold such big truths. In the weeks that followed, fear became part of his routine. He woke up afraid, went to school afraid, came back afraid of what she had done, afraid of what they would do to her, afraid of what they would do to him. Childhood, already fragile, now felt like cracked glass, and no matter how hard he tried to remain just a boy, playing with toy cars in the backyard, he couldn't. Because now he knew. There was something dark, dangerous, growing in the midst of their lives. And he was at the center of it, caught between the love he felt and the truth he was beginning to see. And unbeknownst to him, that would be just the beginning. Because very soon the world would no longer ask him if he wanted to be part of this story. They would force him to choose a side, and he would have to do it in front of everyone, in front of her. After that night, he lived as if walking on invisible shards. Any loud sound made him jump. Any slammed door seemed to announce that the world was about to collapse. His mother tried to maintain her routine as if nothing had changed, but he could see the small fractures in her way of being. Her eyes grew deeper and deeper, as if the light were seeping from within. When he held her, her bones felt more prominent, her skin felt colder. It was like embracing someone who was slowly slipping away, and it terrified him because she was the center of everything he knew, and now it felt like that center was cracking. He began having nightmares every night. He dreamed she disappeared, leaving him alone in the courtroom, surrounded by giant adults shouting questions he couldn't answer. Sometimes he dreamed she was behind bars, crying, and he couldn't reach her no matter how hard he ran. He woke up sweaty, his heart racing with the feeling that the bed was sinking in. He would go to her room and stand in the doorway, just to listen to the sound of her breathing as she slept. It was the only thing that calmed him, knowing she was still there, still his, even if only for a short time. But as the days passed, even her breathing felt fragile, as if it might stop at any moment. At school, everything felt distant, as if it had been submerged in water. His classmates' voices seemed to come from far away. His notebook seemed too heavy to carry. His teacher's words passed him by without lingering. He could no longer pay attention. He spent his time drawing circles in the corners of his paper and staring out the window, trying to imagine what it would be like to live in a world where his mother no longer existed. But every time he reached this point in his thoughts, his chest tightened so much that he had to stop. He couldn't imagine life without her, but at the same time he began to imagine what it would be like when she was gone. It was like living between two futures, unable to choose either. At home, the phone calls became more frequent. She would answer in a low voice, go to her room, and lock the door. When she returned, her eyes were red and her smile was taped shut. He pretended not to notice, but his stomach ached as if he'd swallowed rocks. He began to hear fragments of sentences scattered in the corners. Hearing, formal indictment, testimony. Each word was a new nail driven into a heart too small to bear it all. Sometimes he tried to ask, but she would change the subject with a laugh that sounded more like a cry for help. So he stopped asking. He just watched.
Just absorbed.
Just sank.
Absorbed.
Just sank. The cruelest thing was that even as everything fell apart, she still tried to protect him. She tried to maintain the small rituals, making pancakes on Sundays, combing his hair before school, telling him bedtime stories. But now there was a strange rush to these gestures, as if she were trying to fill the time she had left with good memories. And he sensed it. Children understand when a goodbye is forming even if no one says the word. So every time she hugged him, he hugged her tighter as if trying to keep someone from dissolving into thin air. Because deep down, he was beginning to believe that was what was going to happen. She would disappear, and he would be left forever with the echo of her embrace. Sometimes he thought about telling someone everything, perhaps his teacher, perhaps the priest at church who seemed kind. But then I remembered the phrase, "If he talks, it's all over." It paralyzed him. Talking felt like betrayal. Staying silent felt like condemnation. It was a maze with no way out. So he did what he did best. He hid everything. He started smiling again, saying it's okay even when he wasn't. She began acting like a normal child, because it seemed that if he could convince the world that everything was okay, maybe the world would believe him and spare her. But this pretense came at a price. Every "I'm fine," he said, sounded a little more hollow inside, like an empty shell. The weight of the secret grew with each passing day. Sometimes I felt like I was carrying the entire house on my shoulders, trying to keep it from collapsing on top of them. Her headaches began, her chest tightened for no reason, and food lost its flavor. But she didn't complain. She couldn't complain. She thought that if she showed any sign of weakness, she would crumble completely. So she swallowed the pain, swallowed the hunger, swallowed the fear, all to keep this woman standing whom the world said was guilty, but to him was still just the mother who made pancakes and could sing old songs. And it was in this state, half child, half guardian, that he saw something that sealed the end of the illusion once and for all. One hot night he woke thirsty and went to the kitchen. Her bedroom door was ajar, and he heard the muffled sound of crying. He peeked in, and what he saw remained etched like a photograph he could never burn. His mother kneeling on the floor, hugging a shoebox full of papers, sobbing like a lost child. I didn't want to, she repeated in a desperate whisper. He didn't know what she was talking about, but the pain in her voice seemed heavier than any punishment. It broke something inside him, because until then, deep down, he had still believed she was in control. And now he saw that she wasn't, that she was as lost as he was. After that scene, there was no turning back. The world no longer seemed made of solid ground. It seemed made of quicksand. Each day he sank a little deeper. He began counting down the minutes between classes until he could go home. Not because he wanted to be with her, but because he needed to be sure she was still there. He began hiding small objects from her, her comb, her lipstick, her favorite mug, as if that could keep her from leaving for good. It was magical, childish thinking, but it was the only kind of control he felt he had. And when he found the objects intact the next day, he breathed a sigh of relief as if he had gained another day. Little by little, he began to accept that something terrible was about to happen, and that no one would warn him when it arrived. It was like waiting for a storm that never revealed its day, and this constant waiting began to erase his childhood. He no longer ran, laughed out loud, or dreamed up adventures in the backyard. He spent his days sitting on the sidewalk, watching cars pass by with the distant eyes of someone who had lived more than he should have. The other children called him to play, but he shook his head. How could he play when the world was falling apart? How could he laugh when every laugh seemed to push it a little closer to the end? And so he faded along with her, a little each day, like two candles burning from the same wick. Until one day someone knocked on the door with a summons in hand, and what was just fear became destiny, because in that moment the boy understood. It was no longer a question of whether something bad would happen. It was just a matter of when. When? The secret kept under 7 locks. After the men left that night and his mother knelt on the floor repeating, "I didn't want to," something changed definitively inside him. It was as if he'd passed through an invisible door and entered a world where words were weapons and silence. A shield. He didn't know what she'd done or even if she'd done it, but he knew the world believed she had. And now he also knew he was part of it, not as an innocent witness but as a guardian. Guardian of a secret he didn't understand but which seemed capable of destroying everything. It was too heavy for a 7-year-old boy, but he carried it with the seriousness of someone who believes love can sustain universes. The secret began to grow inside him like a stone. At first it seemed small, something he could hide in the pocket of his conscience. But as the days passed, the stone grew, pushing his thoughts into the corners, taking up space where once there was room for games, dreams, and laughter. He could no longer listen to his classmates at school without wondering if they knew too. Every smile seemed suspicious, every look felt judgmental. When the teacher praised him for a homework assignment, he would shrink back as if he were fooling everyone with his performance. After all, who would think a boy keeping such an ugly secret deserved praise? At home he began to measure every word he said, every gesture he made. He was afraid of saying too much and letting something slip that would give her away. He was even afraid of silence because silence sometimes betrays more than words. When she asked him how school had been, he would answer quickly and smile, trying to appear normal. When she hugged him, he would stiffen inside, wondering if that hug would be one of his last. This thought returned like a cold wave whenever she laughed too loudly or was too happy, as if her joy were a disguised farewell. And the worst part was that even though he was afraid, he wanted her to smile, wanted her to forget whatever she had done. He wanted, by some miracle, it all to vanish like the morning mist in the city. He began devising childish strategies to protect his secret. He hid letters that arrived with government postmarks, tore up notes he found on her desk, and deleted messages he saw flashing on her phone when she wasn't paying attention. He wasn't sure what he was hiding, but he knew he was fighting an invisible enemy intent on taking her away. It was like being in a castle surrounded by soldiers he couldn't see, armed only with silence. And for a 7-year-old, silence was too heavy a sword. Even so, he raised the blade with trembling hands, thinking he could win the war alone. At night, the secret weighed more heavily. Lying in the dark with the ceiling seeming to collapse on him, the boy repeated in his mind, "Don't tell, don't tell, don't tell." It was almost a prayer. He was afraid of dreaming the truth and ending up talking in his sleep. He was afraid of talking in his sleep and someone hearing. So he began to sleep with his mouth closed, his teeth clenched as if that would lock the secret inside him. But the secret wouldn't stay quiet. It whispered in nightmares, crept into his thoughts during the day, clung to every smile he tried to give. And he began to feel that if he kept holding it in, he would eventually disappear inside, becoming nothing more than the outline of a boy, hollow inside. His mother, unaware of the scale of the war he was waging, began to treat him as if he were still a weightless child. She tickled him, laughed loudly, and made plans for the weekend. He pretended to join in the fun, but his mind was always busy calculating risks. Would someone knock on the door today? Would the phone ring with an accusatory voice on the other end? Were the neighbors watching? Even the birds on the power line seemed like spies. It was a constant state of alert, as if the world were a trap set and he was trying to get through it without stepping on any. Children shouldn't live like this, but he did. His heart racing as if he were always running away, even when standing still. Sometimes the secret felt like it was about to explode. There were moments when he felt a desperate need to tell someone, not because he wanted to betray her, but because he wanted to share the burden before it crushed them both. He even rehearsed confessions in front of the mirror. "There's something I need to tell you." He'd begin, then quickly stop, terrified that even the mirror might give it away. She also considered writing it all down on a piece of paper and hiding it at the bottom of her backpack, as if that would ease the pressure. But then she remembered the phrase, "If he tells, it's all over," and fear would overcome her again, forcing the confession back down her throat like someone swallowing fire. Loneliness became the price of silence. He withdrew from his classmates, his teachers, even the games he once loved. He sat in the back of the room, silent, drawing endless mazes in his notebook, perhaps because he felt trapped in one. When someone asked if he was okay, he would reply, "I am," with an automatic smile, almost a reflex. But inside he wasn't. Inside it was as if he were huddled in a dark corner trying to shield a fragile flame from a strong wind. That flame was him, and he knew that if it went out, there would be nothing left. The cruelest thing was that the secret he thought he was protecting began to protect him too, in a twisted way. It served as a shield against the greater pain, facing the possibility of losing her. As long as she kept the secret locked away, she could pretend there was still hope, that maybe everything would end well, that maybe she would never leave. It was an illusion, and he knew it, but it was the only thing that made him get out of bed in the morning and walk to school with his shoulders held high, pretending the world was still safe. And so he clutched that secret so tightly that the fingers of his soul ached. But secrets grow. They grow like roots breaking through cement, and he was beginning to feel the cracks. Over time, the secret stopped feeling like something he kept and started feeling like something that kept him. It was always there, hidden behind every thought, peering over his shoulder even when I tried to play. If he flew a kite, the string would get tangled, and he'd think, "If I tell, it'll all be over." If he laughed with a friend, the laughter would stop mid-laugh, because the image of his mother kneeling on the floor, hugging the box of papers, came to him. It was like living with a shadow clinging to his back, a shadow that grew as he shrank. And every day he shrank a little more, as if trying to fit within his own silence. The other children seemed made of light. They played in the playground, sweaty and noisy, as if the world were just that moment. He watched them from afar with a lump in his throat he couldn't name. It wasn't envy, it was longing. Longing for a time when he too felt light before the secret. Sometimes he wanted to scream at them, tell them everything, just to see if someone would hug him and say, "You don't have to carry this." But the fear that no one would say that was greater, so he stayed quiet, watching the smiles of others as if observing a forgotten language. The joy of others felt like a place he no longer belonged. At home, he became an obsessed guardian. He spent his days watching over his mother like someone guarding a piece of glass about to shatter. He watched to see if she ate, if she slept, if she cried in secret. When she went out, he'd wait at the window, his eyes glued to the street, his heart racing with every footstep that echoed on the pavement. When she returned, he'd smile with relief, but inside he was breathing like someone who'd survived a landslide. He began secretly organizing her belongings. He'd put away her bills, line up her shoes, seal her food jars, as if ordering things could prevent the world from falling apart. It was his childish way of trying to control the uncontrollable. At night, the secret gained voices. He lay on his side and heard his own thoughts like whispers. If you fail, she disappears. If you speak, she disappears. If you get distracted, she disappears. It was blackmail he was using against himself, but he didn't know it. He only knew that fear kept him awake. He began to have recurring nightmares. He would dream he'd come home from school and the house would be empty, the walls bare, as if they'd never been there. Or he would dream she was in court looking at him with tearful eyes, and he would open his mouth to defend her, but no words would come out. He would wake with the pillow soaked, his mouth dry and his throat burning from holding back his tears. He began developing small, superstitious rituals, believing that this would keep the world stable. He knocked 3 times on the door before entering the house, hid a red button from her coat under his pillow, and always took the same route to school, avoiding the cracks in the sidewalk. He believed that if he did everything exactly the same every day, nothing would change, no one would knock on the door, and his mother would still be there. Children create logic where none exists when the real world becomes too unpredictable. For him, every detail was a wall he built around himself, a wall that only he knew how to keep standing, and that for that very reason, he couldn't let fall. Little by little, the secret began to blur his sense of who he was. Before, he saw himself as the boy who made up stories in the backyard, who laughed until his stomach hurt, who drew pictures of dragons and stars. Now, when he looked in the mirror, he saw a stranger with eyes too tired for his age, a small adult disguised as a child. He no longer knew if he smiled because he wanted to, or because he needed to deceive the world. He no longer knew if he spoke to express himself or to protect what could not be said. It was as if he had forgotten what it was like to live without hiding something, and in this forgetfulness he began to lose himself. Isolation grew like ivy. He stopped playing with his street friends, stopped responding to the teacher's notes, even stopped writing in his school diary. He said he was tired, but the truth was different. He didn't want to leave a trace. He was afraid that any word would reveal what he kept hidden. His life became a silent stage where he performed alone, performing the play of the quiet child for an audience unaware of the show. And this loneliness began to hurt in a strange way, a pain that didn't burn or throb. It just weighed down, as if he were carrying his own house on his back. There was one afternoon when he nearly broke down. He was sitting in the yard poking the dirt with a twig when his teacher appeared on the sidewalk. She had gone to drop off the notebooks he had forgotten at school. She smiled sweetly and said, "You look sad, are you okay?" For a second he felt the secret tremble inside his chest, ready to escape through his mouth. The voice came alone, a whisper, "If I tell you, my mother will disappear." The teacher frowned, not understanding. He froze. Panic rose through him like ice water. Then he laughed suddenly, a strange laugh, too loud, and said, "I'm joking." The teacher smiled back hesitantly and left. He stood there, the fake laugh still echoing in his throat and the tears falling soundlessly. He realized he no longer knew when he was pretending and when he was being real. That night he made a silent vow to himself. He wouldn't speak. Ever. No matter what. If she left, he would go with her. If she fell, he would fall with her. Because in his mind, love and loyalty had become the same thing, and breaking the silence would be like breaking love. He didn't realize that by doing so he was erasing himself so that she could continue to exist. But that was the price he was willing to pay. It was either that or lose her. And so, night after night, the boy became a living safe. A locked, sealed safe where a heart beat too small for its weight. He guarded the secret like one guards a diamond or a ticking time bomb. He knew that one day someone would knock on the door and ask him to open the safe. And when that day came, everything would change forever, but until then, he would remain silent, even if the silence destroyed him first. The official's visit. The afternoon began like any other in the small town, with the smell of freshly baked bread wafting from the bakery and the church bells tolling 3 o'clock. The boy was in the yard balancing one stone on another, as if building small towers to hold up the sky. His mother was washing clothes in the sink, softly humming an old song, the kind that spoke of impossible loves. For a moment it seemed time had forgotten them, but time forgets no one, and sometimes it chooses the most peaceful moments to crumble. The sound came first, 3 firm knocks on the front door. They weren't ordinary knocks like neighbors asking for sugar. They were heavy, measured knocks that vibrated through the floor and up the boy's legs like a shock. He froze. His mother also stopped singing. For a second, the world hung suspended as if she'd held her breath. Then she hurriedly wiped her hands on her apron, smoothed her hair, and said in a forced light tone, "It must be the mailman." But her eyes said otherwise. They said it wasn't the mailman, and they both knew it. He stood in the kitchen doorway, watching with wide eyes as she walked to the door. Each step seemed slower than the last, as if she were walking toward some inevitable fate. When the door opened, 2 men stood there. One wore a dark suit, the other the blue uniform of the local police. The one in the suit spoke with studied calm, his voice low but firm, as if holding sharp words behind his teeth. "Good afternoon. We have a summons for you to appear in court." His mother nodded wordlessly, her fingers trembling so slightly that perhaps only the boy noticed. But he noticed everything. She tried to smile. She thanked him, took the envelope, and closed the door slowly, as if she didn't want the outside world to come in with her. But the world came in anyway, glued to the brown paper that now lay on the living room table like a sleeping, dangerous animal. The boy approached slowly, his heart pounding loudly in his chest, each beat echoing in his head like the sound of church bells. "What's this, Mom?" he asked. She took a moment to answer. She looked at him with a tight smile and said, "Nothing to worry about." But it was too late for that kind of answer. Worry had been living in him for months, and now it had a uniform. After the men left, the silence grew thick in the house. It wasn't the usual small-town silence made of wind and crickets. It was a heavy silence, full of unsaid things like the still air before a storm. His mother spent the afternoon wandering aimlessly around the house, picking up objects and putting them down, as if she'd forgotten their purpose. He followed her with his eyes, feeling a strange urge to do something, anything, to stop the world from taking her away. He wanted to hide the envelope, tear it up, burn it, swallow it, but he knew that wouldn't erase the truth. And the truth now was officially knocking at the door. In the following days, the officers returned again. Sometimes with clipboards, sometimes with folders, always with expressions that seemed tailored to reveal nothing. They asked questions he didn't understand, and although they always spoke directly to his mother, he noticed their eyes resting on him for a moment each time, as if sizing him up, as if they already knew he would one day be called upon to speak. The thought made him nauseous. His stomach churned. His hands sweated. His heart raced as if it were racing even while standing still. He began to hate the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk. Each step closer to the door made his mind scream, "They've come for her!" His mother tried to feign normalcy, but her mask was crumbling. She kept making pancakes but forgot the sugar. She kept combing his hair before school, but her fingers trembled and the comb got tangled in the strands. Sometimes she'd stop mid-sentence and stare into space, as if her mind had slipped into a place he couldn't follow. He watched her with a heavy heart, thinking that maybe he was already losing her even before they took her. And that was what hurt the most, knowing he might be orphaned by someone who was still alive. The officers' visits became part of the routine, as if they were just another shift in the day. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, school. Tuesday and Thursday, fear. On Saturdays, he would stay by the window the entire time, keeping watch, even though he knew they were unlikely to come. It didn't matter. He was always ready to run to his mother and warn her, like a little guard on alert. But the worst part was she no longer seemed to fight. She answered the officer's questions with icy calm, as if she already knew the end of the story and just wanted to get there. And that drove him to despair, because if even she had given up, what was left for him to hold on to? The secret he'd been keeping now seemed exposed to everyone, even though no one had said anything yet. Every neighbor who waved seemed to know. Every teacher who called his name seemed about to ask. He began to feel like everything in him screamed, "My world is about to end," even when he didn't say a word. And this contrast of appearing calm on the outside while crumbling on the inside left him exhausted. He'd come home from school and sleep for hours, a deep, dreamless sleep like someone drifting off to escape their own mind. But he'd wake in the middle of the night panting, certain someone was knocking on the door again. Little by little, he began to associate any loud sound with the arrival of officers. Doors slamming, heavy footsteps, distant horns, everything put his body on alert. It was as if he had an invisible alarm attached to his heart, constantly going off. When someone said officer in any context, even if it was just on television, his stomach would turn. He began to avoid words that evoked court, justice, or the police. It seemed even words could summon fate. Children think like that sometimes. They believe that naming something will make it appear. And he couldn't take that risk. So he spoke less and less, and the silence, which had once been protection, now began to become a prison. His mother, noticing his withdrawn demeanor, began to try to cheer him up, as if fanning the flames of a dying ember. She spoke of trips they would take when everything was over, of big cities and distant beaches he only knew from geography books. But he couldn't believe it. Each sentence sounded like a promise made with frayed strings about to snap. All he could think was, what if she's no longer here when that day comes? That thought was a stone in his chest, a stone that grew larger every time the officers knocked on the door, every time the world entered the house and left, taking a piece of her with it, until one cloudy morning. The officers didn't come with clipboards or folders. They came with a notice, a date set, a hearing scheduled, names of witnesses. And there, among the papers he could barely read, was his name. Small, fragile, lost among the large, daunting words, but unmistakable. His own name, and in that moment, the secret he had kept for so long was no longer just his. Now the world wanted to rip it out of him, even if it destroyed him along with it. When his mother put the papers away in the china cabinet drawer, her hands still shaking, he remained standing in the same place, as if his body had forgotten how to move. His name still danced in his head like a light creature trapped behind his eyes. Letters that had always been light now weighed like lead. He couldn't understand why anyone wanted to hear what he had to say. What could a child tell about adult crimes? But he knew, deep down, they didn't want stories about pancakes or how she sang him to sleep. They wanted something else. They wanted what he'd spent months burying in silence. They wanted the secret, and they wanted to rip it out of him, even if it tore everything inside him apart. His mother tried to smile as if nothing had happened. She said it was just a procedure and that everything would be fine. But her voice was too small, too thin, like wet paper about to tear. He nodded, still in disbelief. He spent the rest of the day sitting in the doorway, staring out at the empty street, trying to imagine a world where she would still be there after it was all over. But each attempt ended in the same place. Him in court, her leaving, and the world closing behind her like a door too heavy to reopen. The idea of living without her was like trying to imagine breathing without air. It simply didn't fit. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay wide-eyed, his chest rising and falling rapidly as if he'd run a marathon without getting out of bed. He tried counting sheep as the teacher had taught him, but the sheep had the faces of officers and carried briefcases instead of wool. So he went out into the yard in his socks, the cold ground biting his feet. He stared at the dark sky and thought he wanted to be a star. Stars don't have to say anything, they just shine. No one demands they tell the truth. No one can tear them away. But he wasn't a star. He was a boy with a huge secret, and now the world wanted to make him a witness. In the days that followed, everything lost its flavor. The food tasted gray, the air felt heavy, the toys felt empty. Even the birds on the light string seemed to look at him with pity. At school, his classmates' voices sounded distant, and he wondered if any of them had ever experienced something like this, being forced to choose between protecting the ones they loved and obeying the world. Probably not. They were probably preoccupied with stickers and marble tournaments. Sometimes he felt angry at them for this, for leading a life where their greatest fear was missing recess. But soon he felt guilty for feeling angry. He was becoming someone he didn't recognize, withdrawn, silent, heavy. He began to avoid speaking to everyone. Every word felt dangerous, as if any sentence could be used against him. If the teacher asked about his mother, he answered in monosyllables. If his classmates asked if he wanted to play, he shook his head and walked away. He spent recess alone, pacing in circles, muttering to himself, "I can't talk, I can't talk, I can't talk." It was like an inverted prayer, meant to keep the world at bay. And at the same time, each repetition made it feel like the truth was growing inside him, pushing against his ribs, trying to force its way out. At home, his mother tried to maintain normalcy, but she was different too. She spoke to him as if walking on thin ice, choosing each word carefully. She began kissing him on the forehead several times a day, as if to store the memory of her touch before it was too late. He noticed this and tried to respond, but her embrace now hurt. It was warm on the outside and desperate on the inside, like hugging someone in the middle of a shipwreck. Sometimes he curled up in her lap and thought he wished he could go back to when he was 4, and the world fit in her arms. But time doesn't go backward. And now he was 7 and the weight of a 70-year-old. Word that he would be called to testify began to circulate around town even before he understood exactly what testify meant. Adults whispered in the street. Neighbors watched with a mixture of pity and curiosity, like someone watching a sad movie they can't put down. As he passed, the conversations quieted down, but their eyes widened. It made him feel sick, as if he were riding a merry-go-round too fast. Now it wasn't just his mother on trial. It was him too, even though he'd done nothing. Just for loving the one the world wanted to destroy. Sometimes I imagined running away. I fantasized that one night they would both take the night train that passed through the city and go somewhere where no one would know who they were. A place where there were no courts, no summonses, no sharp questions. A place where he could be just a son and she just a mother. But soon the fantasy faded because I knew she wouldn't run. Not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. She seemed too tired even to run. So he decided he would stay. If she was going to fall, he would fall with her. He didn't know if that was courage or desperation, but it was all he had. The night before the officer's next visit, his fear grew so great that he couldn't sit still. He paced his room, his hands sweating, his heart racing. He considered hiding in the closet when they arrived, or pretending to be sick, or disappearing altogether. But he knew none of that would change what was to come. So he did what he did when nothing else worked, he wrote. He took a piece of paper from his backpack and scrawled in crooked letters, "I don't want to tell. I love her." He folded the paper and placed it under his pillow like a charm. Maybe, he thought, if the world saw those words, they would understand he wasn't to blame, that he was just a boy trying not to lose the only person he had. The next morning, the officers returned. The same firm knock on the door, the same controlled voices, the same assessing eyes. But this time it wasn't just paperwork. There were dates, times, instructions, and the mother, her voice barely above a whisper, said, "They want to hear from you." And in that instant, everything he feared most stopped being a distant possibility. It became a deadline, pressured by silence ever since he heard the phrase, "They want to hear you." The world had felt too tight to fit around him. The city streets felt narrower, the school hallways more suffocating, even the air felt heavier. It was like walking inside an invisible box that shrank a little each day. Before, the secret had been his alone, a stone hidden in his chest. Now it was as if the whole world were pushing that stone out, trying to force his mouth open, and he knew that once the words came out, there would be no taking them back. They would be like glass shattering on the floor, impossible to put back together. The silence, which had once felt like a shield, was now a trap. With each passing hour, the pressure grew as if the whole world were waiting for him to say something. His teacher began to look at him strangely. His neighbors whispered more quietly as he passed. Even the grocery store clerk began to speak with exaggerated care, as if he were made of glass. And perhaps he was. He felt as if any touch could make him crack and spill everything he held inside. So he began to avoid glances, avoid conversations, avoid anything that might open fissures in the silence. At home, his mother tried to act as if nothing had changed, but her smile was fragile, her hands trembling, her eyes filled with a sadness she could no longer hide. Sometimes he'd catch her staring into space, her lips moving in silent prayers. Other times she'd hug him so tightly it seemed she was trying to press him to her chest. This left him even more torn, because at the same time as he wanted to protect her from the world, he wanted to protect her from himself, from what he might say that would hurt her more than any sentence. Love and fear were now so intertwined that he no longer knew which made him tremble more. At night, the silence rang in his ears. He lay face down, his eyes wide, feeling the weight of the ceiling on his chest. He imagined the courtroom as a marble monster, with a huge mouth and iron eyes, waiting for him to say the right words to decide whether or not his mother would live in his world. And he didn't know which were the right words, the ones the adults wanted to hear, or the ones he wanted to say. He only knew that the two couldn't be the same, and that terrified him. The realization that no matter what he said, some part of him would be destroyed. He began to talk to himself, whispering phrases as he paced the yard. He practiced ways to tell the truth without hurting her, but every sentence sounded like daggers. He tried to imagine how the officers would react, how his mother would react, how the world would react, and in each version she would cry, disappear, or look at him with those terrified eyes he'd seen the day he caught her tearing up papers on the living room floor. Then he fell silent. He always fell silent. He remained silent until his throat ached, until his eyes burned. The silence began to feel like acid, burning from the inside out, but he saw no other way out. If speaking was betrayal and silence was a sentence, what was left? Fear began to take its toll on his body. His stomach ached constantly, his hands were sweaty, and his breath came in shallow gasps as if he were running even when standing still. Sometimes he felt dizzy just thinking about the hearing. The teacher thought he was sick and called his mother, but he knew it wasn't illness. It was the silence turning to stone inside him, crushing everything. Even the simplest words began to vanish from his mind. He'd forget what he was going to say mid-sentence, and he'd become mute when asked the silliest questions. It was as if his mind were erasing everything, leaving no room for the truth to escape. And this thought made him even more desperate because it seemed to be disappearing before he even opened his mouth. There was one afternoon when he almost told her. He was at school, and the teacher asked them to write a letter to someone they loved. All his classmates had written to their parents, grandparents, friends. He stared at the blank paper, the pen trembling in his fingers. Then he began to write. "Dear Mom, I know what happened." He stopped there. He stared at the words until they were blurred with tears. Then he tore the paper into tiny pieces and swallowed them, one by one, as if that way he could put the words back inside. The teacher asked him why he hadn't written anything. He said he'd forgotten. But the truth was, he remembered everything, and that was precisely what hurt. His mother noticed he was becoming increasingly withdrawn and tried to talk, but he couldn't. Every time she said, "Are you okay?" he felt the words choke in his throat, caught between what he wanted to say and what he couldn't. So he smiled and said, "I am." As always. Only now even the smile felt heavy. He began to avoid her touch, not because he didn't want to, but because each hug felt like a reminder of everything he was about to lose. Hugging her was like holding a fading photograph. The tighter he held it, the more it seemed to fade, and it was in this state, half silence, half choked scream, that the days began to pass like leaves carried by the wind. Each one seemed shorter, narrower, tighter. The date of the hearing approached like a distant train that even far away already made the ground tremble. And the boy, too small to be a hero and too old to be innocent, desperately tried to hold the tracks with his hands, but the train wouldn't stop. The days began to taste like iron. He would wake with a dry mouth, his chest tight, as if he'd run a marathon in his sleep. The silence, which had once been a hiding place, now felt like a cell. He was trapped inside himself. And the worst part was no one understood, nor did they want to understand. Adults thought muteness was shyness. His classmates thought it was a bad mood. No one saw the scream trapped behind his eyes, spinning like a caged animal. He began to avoid the mirror, because the reflection stared back at him with a strange, hard gaze unbecoming of a 7-year-old boy. It felt like the gaze of someone much older, and much more tired. The pressure mounted with each new day crossed off on the calendar. He could hear the clock's hands like giant footsteps approaching. Sometimes he would stop in the middle of the room and stand still, listening only to the ticking, trying to delay time with the power of his thoughts. But time didn't listen. It kept walking, cruel and impervious to his pain. At night he dreamed of the hearing. He saw a huge room full of adults staring at him with stony eyes. He saw his mother sitting on the other side, alone, her eyes brimming with tears. And he saw himself in the center, trying to open his mouth and failing. The silence in the dream was deafening, so loud that I would wake screaming without sound. His mother, noticing he was growing more and more dejected, began to tell him stories from her childhood, trying to bring lightness. She spoke of June festivals, the smell of popcorn and bonfires, the afternoons climbing trees just to see the horizon. He listened silently, his eyes fixed on her, trying to memorize every detail like someone recording a movie to watch after the lead actor has passed. Each laugh of hers felt like a disguised goodbye. Sometimes he imagined that would be the last time he would hear that laugh, and that made him want to cry, but he didn't. He no longer cried for anything, as if the silence had sealed even the tears. Confusion began to blur his sense of right and wrong. He'd always thought telling the truth was the right thing to do, because his teacher said lying was ugly, and his priest said the truth set you free, but now the truth felt like a gun pointed at his mother's heart. If he told what he knew, maybe she would disappear. If he remained silent, maybe he would save her, but he would destroy himself in the process. This impossible equation swirled in his mind day and night, never stopping. He began to think that maybe the grown-ups were wrong about what right was. Maybe the right thing, he thought, was to protect the ones you love, even if the whole world said otherwise. That thought would calm him for a few minutes, and then fill him with guilt, because deep down he knew the world wouldn't see it that way. The adults would call him an accomplice, a liar, manipulable. That word accomplice, he'd heard one of the officers say. It was heavy, ugly, full of edges. He kept repeating it in his mind. Accomplice, 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 until he felt like the word was glued to his forehead, visible to everyone. And if everyone already thought he was an accomplice, maybe there was no point in speaking up or keeping quiet. Maybe he was already condemned for loving his mother too much. That thought pierced him like ice melting through his bones. He began to avoid even his own mother, afraid that the love he felt would escape through his eyes and reveal everything. He spent more time locked in his room making excuses not to have dinner with her. When she knocked on the door and asked, "Can I come in?" and he would reply that he was asleep even though he was awake. He didn't want her to see the fear on his face. Because if she saw, maybe she would understand that he knew, and if she understood, maybe she would stop fighting for good, and he couldn't let that happen. So he hid even his love, the most beautiful thing he had. He hid everything. The only thing he couldn't hide was the trembling in his hands, which wouldn't stop. Sometimes he thought about getting hurt slightly. Nothing serious, just enough to keep him from going to court. He fantasized that if he broke his arm or got sick, the adults would let him off the hook. But the fear of worrying his mother was greater. So he remained whole on the outside and shattered on the inside. He began to imagine what it would be like to disappear completely, to run away, to vanish, to become a nameless person in another city. A place where no one would ask, where he could just be a child. Sometimes he saw himself running along the train tracks that crossed the city at dusk. The train would leave, he would go with it, and the secret would remain behind like a shadow unable to keep up with the speed of the escape. But the train was just fantasy. Reality was the clock ticking, the date approaching, the world closing in like a giant mouth. And he tiny, trying to hold back the mouth's tongue to avoid being swallowed. He no longer knew if he wanted to save his mother, save himself, or simply disappear with them both at once. He only knew that the silence, which had once felt like fidelity, now felt like poison. Each day of silence corroded him more. He was becoming a shell, a small body with a deafening noise inside. And amidst this noise, a cold certainty emerged. In court, no one would care about love. They would only care about words, and that was exactly what terrified him. Because the words the world wanted to hear were the only ones he couldn't say. Court day the morning began cold, even for a city that rarely experienced cold. The boy woke before the sun, his eyes open in the darkness as if he hadn't truly slept. The room seemed smaller than ever, the walls closer, the ceiling lower. The silence was different, not the heavy silence of the last few months, but a sharp, piercing silence like the moment before thunder. He sat up in bed with trembling hands and lay there, feeling his heart pounding too hard for such a small body. It was the day he'd spent weeks trying to push from his mind, the day that always seemed far away, until it arrived. His mother knocked softly on the door, but he was already on his feet. When she entered, she was wearing a dark dress he'd never seen before. Her hair tightly tied back, her eyes rimmed with eyeliner that looked more like armor than makeup. She forced a smile, but her eyes didn't smile back. "You're up early, my love," she said, trying to sound light. He just nodded. He couldn't say anything. He was afraid that if he opened his mouth, the tears would come before he could speak. So he let her dress him in silence like when he was younger. She straightened the collar of his shirt, ran her hand through his hair and whispered, "It'll be okay." He wanted to believe her, but the words sounded like a paper umbrella in a downpour. The path to the courthouse seemed like an endless corridor. They walked, because the town was small and every stone seemed to scream what he was about to do. People looked as they passed, some with pity, others with that cold curiosity small-town people have when someone else's troubles are theirs. He didn't look back. He fixed his eyes on his shoes, counting his steps so as not to think. He wanted the ground to open up and swallow them both, to some place where time didn't exist and no one would ask him to choose between being a son and being a witness. When they reached the courthouse, the world felt too big. The wooden doors seemed as high as walls. The windows had thin, cold bars, the floor gleamed like ice. The sound of footsteps echoed, amplified by the stone walls. Each noise seemed to scream, "You don't belong here." His mother handed him some papers at the reception desk and led him to a wooden bench in the hallway. "Wait here, okay?" she said with a fragile smile. He nodded, his hands hidden between his legs so no one could see they were shaking. The hallway smelled of alcohol and old paper, and the clock on the wall made a noise that seemed to be ticking inside his head. As he waited, he watched the adults pass by, men in suits carrying briefcases, women in heels with stiff steps, uniformed police officers with serious expressions. Everyone seemed to know exactly who they were and what they were doing there. Only he felt like an intruder, too small, too lost. He thought that maybe if he stood still enough, no one would see him. Maybe they would forget him there and leave, and he could go back home and lie in the backyard staring at the sky like he used to. But then one of the officers appeared at the end of the hallway and said his name. The sound of his own name felt foreign. He stood up on shaky legs as if his bones had turned to rubber. The courtroom was cold and enormous, with a ceiling so high it was blindingly bright. The chairs were large and heavy, as if designed to prevent escape. The judge stood in the center behind a high, throne-like table, his face as serious as a statue. Beside him, prosecutors leafed through papers. Lawyers whispered, and in the background some townspeople watched in silence. The boy entered slowly, feeling all eyes fall on him at once like stones. He wanted to run, but his feet seemed glued to the floor. When his eyes met hers, the world inside him cracked. His mother sat across the room, her hands clasped in her lap, her shoulders stiff, her eyes watering. She tried to smile, but it was just a sad smile that barely held. In that moment, he wanted to run to her, curl up in her lap like he did when he fell off his bike. But he knew he couldn't. Now there was an invisible line between them, drawn by the adult world, a line that said he was there to talk about her, not to her, and it made him feel like a traitor before he'd even said a word. A clerk led him to the witness seat. It was too big for him, and his feet didn't reach the floor. His legs dangled in the air, trembling on their own. The judge looked at him over his glasses and said something about telling the truth. The sentence echoed through the room but didn't sink in. He could only hear the sound of his own heart, pounding loudly like a door being broken down from the inside. He took a deep breath, trying to recall the words he'd rehearsed in his head over the past few weeks, but they all fled like frightened birds. The questions began, firm adult voices full of words he didn't understand. They asked where he was on a certain day, what he saw, what he heard. He answered in a low, scratchy voice as if the words were scraping in his throat to come out. With each answer, he glanced at his mother. She stared at him with eyes full of unshed tears, as if holding the world between her eyelashes. And it broke him inside, because he felt that no matter what he said, her eyes would never be the same again. They were filled with fear. Fear of him, fear of what he might say, fear of her beloved son turned into a blade. The questions became more direct, harsher. They wanted him to describe things he'd seen, words he'd heard, details he held like thorns in his chest. Each sentence that emerged seemed to tug at a thread within him, and he was afraid that by the time he finished, there would be nothing left. He broke out in a cold sweat, his vision blurred, and his breath seemed short. The room spun slowly. He heard someone tell him to calm down, but the voice seemed to come from far away. All he could think was that he was killing his mother with every word. Each answer was a small death, of hers, of him, of what they were together. When the judge finally said they could ask the last question, his heart seemed to be bursting. His fingers were numb, his eyes were watery, but he didn't cry. He couldn't cry. Crying would make him look guilty, and if he did, they might take her away faster. So he stood still, swallowing the pain as the last question fell upon him like thunder. It was simple, direct, sharp as a blade. "Do you confirm that this is what happened?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence after the question seemed to last for hours. The entire room held its breath, waiting for those tiny vocal cords to decide a woman's fate. He felt the weight of that collective gaze, as if dozens of invisible hands were pushing his back against the chair, forcing him to speak. His mother's eyes were on him, steady, moist, desperate, and it tore him apart. Those were the eyes that had seen him take his first steps, that had comforted him in his childhood fevers, that had laughed when he drew his first picture of a dog that looked like an airplane. Now those same eyes silently pleaded, "Don't kill me with words." His throat was dry, scratchy, as if he'd swallowed glass. He tried to speak, but his voice came out only a whisper. The judge frowned, and the prosecutor repeated the question. "Can you confirm that's what happened?" It was as if the words came with blades attached. He looked at the papers, at the serious faces of the adults, at the room that resembled a stone giant, and then at his mother, and felt the world split in two. Because he knew that anything he said would destroy a part of who he was. If he told the truth, he would kill his mother. If you lied, you would kill yourself, and yet the world wanted you to choose. At 7 years old, the words came low, trembling, driven by fear. He spoke what he had seen, what he had heard, trying to make his voice sound mechanical, as if he were reading a story that wasn't his. Each sentence seemed to steal a piece of his soul, as if he were bleeding inside, unseen. As he spoke, he stared at a fixed spot on the wall, avoiding her eyes, because if he did, he would crumble. But even without looking, he felt her eyes burning into him, and it hurt more than any physical punishment he had ever known. It was as if he were holding her hand and at the same time pushing her away. When he finished, silence fell again. Heavy, immense, almost solid. The judge thanked him. Someone took notes. Another officer led him out as if he were a fragile object that couldn't be dropped. But he had already fallen. Inside, he was in pieces. He walked down the hallway on shaky legs, his ears ringing, the world blurry as if he were underwater. He couldn't remember how he got to the lobby bench. He only realized he was sitting there because the bench felt cold against the backs of his legs. His hands were numb, his eyes too dry to cry. It was as if he'd left everything there, his tears, his childhood, his own name. His mother emerged sometime later, escorted by 2 police officers. She was pale, her shoulders hunched, her eyes watering, but she wasn't crying. As she passed him, she paused for a second. They stared at each other, and in that look a whole world could be seen. Love, pain, fear, sorrow, resignation. She slowly raised her hand, lightly touching his hair, and forced a small, almost imperceptible smile. Then she was let out. He stood watching her walk away, each step echoing like a farewell bell. He wanted to run to her, shout that he meant none of this, that he still loved her, that he was still hers. But his feet wouldn't obey. They were rooted to the ground, or perhaps to the weight of guilt. Outside, the sky had darkened even though it was early. The air smelled of rain, and the first drops began to fall as he and a worker waited for a distant relative to pick him up. Each drop that hit the sidewalk seemed to mark the end of something. He felt empty, like a house after a move, with echoes still trapped in the walls but no one to hear them. He knew he had done what adults called right, but none of it felt right. Right shouldn't hurt so much. Right shouldn't leave such a big hole where a boy's heart once was. On the way back, the car passed through familiar streets, but nothing seemed familiar. The houses seemed smaller, the trees grayer, even the sky seemed farther away. The city was no longer the same, or maybe it was he who no longer was. I didn't know if I would ever be able to go back to being the boy who believed love was enough to protect someone. Now I knew that love alone doesn't stop the world. The world comes just like that, with papers, with officials, with courts, and sometimes it forces children to say things they should never need to say, things that become scars before they even heal. When he got home, the first thing he did was lock himself in his room and take off his shoes, the same ones he'd worn to court. He stared at them for a while as if they were guilty. Then he pushed them into the back of the closet and lay down on the floor, not on the bed. on the floor, where the world couldn't fall any further. He lay there motionless, staring at the ceiling, trying not to think, but the image of her kept coming back. Her moist eyes, her fragile smile, her hand touching his hair before she was taken away. And with that image came the question that would stay with him for years. Did she still love him? Or had he in that moment stopped being his son and become his enemy? Sleep came heavy, dreamless, like a blackout, and when he woke, the house seemed bigger and emptier than ever. It was as if childhood had ended the very moment he opened his mouth in court. The silence after the storm. The town seemed to have swallowed its own tongue after the court. The gossip suddenly ceased as if everyone had agreed to remain silent. Neighbors who had previously whispered now looked away. Shopkeepers stopped commenting. Even the teacher began to treat him with an uncomfortable sweetness, as if speaking to someone who had returned from a funeral. But this silence wasn't peace, it was gray. A dense, pasty gray that twisted into the days and made everything seem slow, muffled, distant. And in the center of this gray, he was still, small, trying to understand how the world could continue to exist when his mother was no longer in it. The house was different. There was no clang of pots on the stove, no off-key sound of her mother singing into the sink, no scent of cheap soap in the hallway. Everything seemed still, like a set after a show. The furniture was in place but felt colder. The rooms were larger and emptier, as if they had grown with sadness. The boy walked barefoot through the rooms like someone walking through a museum, touching things carefully, afraid they would fall apart. Sometimes I would stop in front of her bedroom door and wait for a sigh, a sneeze, any sound that would prove she still existed there in some form. But all I heard was my own heart beating too loudly in my chest. For the first few days, I waited for her to return. I imagined she'd walk through the door with a weary smile, saying it had all been a big mistake, that the adults had realized their mistake, that it could be just the two of them again. He'd sit for hours on the threshold, staring down the street, waiting for the curve of the gate to reveal the familiar silhouette. Every passing figure made his heart race and then plummet. At night, he'd leave the hallway light on like a beacon to guide her back. But the days passed and she didn't come, and the beacon began to seem useless, like a lit candle in a sea of wind. The silence wasn't just in the house, it was inside him too. A heavy, thick silence that smothered even his thoughts. Before, his mind had been full of voices, stories, and questions. Now there was only a distant echo. Guilt had taken up residence there, occupying the place where childhood had once lived. Every time he tried to play, guilt came and told him he couldn't have fun while it was gone. Every time he smiled, guilt told him smiling was a betrayal. It was like living with a ghost sitting on his shoulder, whispering that he had been his own mother's executioner, and somehow he believed it. Food lost its taste. He ate mechanically as if he were completing a task. Hunger was replaced by a weight in his stomach, a stone that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. At school, his classmates' voices sounded distant, their faces blurred as if he were seeing everything through wet glass. When the teacher asked questions, he took a long time to answer, as if the words had to cross a swamp within his mind before reaching his mouth. Some classmates laughed, others whispered, but he didn't care. He couldn't care anymore. The only thing that mattered was gone, and it seemed to have taken all the colors with it. Sometimes he dreamed of her. He dreamed he was at home making pancakes, singing, laughing like before. He would wake with a brief, naive smile, and for a second he would forget, but the empty room would quickly remind him, and the smile would vanish before it even reached his face. Other times he dreamed of the courtroom, and in those dreams she wouldn't look at him, wouldn't say anything, just walked away while he screamed that he hadn't meant to speak, that he still loved her. He would wake sweaty, with the pillow wet, and huddle in the corner of the bed wishing he could shrink until he disappeared, because it seemed only disappearance would erase the guilt. The distant family that now took him in tried to help, but it all felt false, strange, like furniture from another house that didn't fit his. They were kind, providing food, clean clothes, a roof over his head, but they didn't know what to do with the silence he carried. They tried to elicit smiles, but the smiles were broken, dull. When they asked how he was, he said fine, and they nodded, relieved, not realizing that that fine was just a screen hiding ruins. He didn't blame them. How could they understand? They weren't there when the world came crashing down on him, complete with robes, hammers, and letterhead. He began writing her name on scraps of paper, hiding them around the house. He wrote and folded them until they were very small, as if to keep her name safe from oblivion. He kept them in his pockets, in his shoes, under his pillow. It was as if he feared that if her name disappeared, she would disappear with it. And deep down he feared this more than anything, that she would be forgotten, erased as if she had never existed. Because to the rest of the world she was just a file, a number in a file. But to him she was the entire universe, and now it seemed that universe had imploded, and he floated alone in the cold space left behind. In the rare moments he could think without crying, he wondered how she was, if she ate, if she slept, if she thought about him, if she still loved him, even after everything. That question returned like a tide every morning, every night. Does she still love me? Maybe, he thought, she hated him now. Maybe she saw him as a traitor. The thought destroyed him inside, but it seemed fair. After all, he saw himself that way. A 7-year-old traitor who traded his mother's love for the abstract promise of adult justice. And if justice had been served, why then did everything seem so unfair? The hours dragged by. The days felt like weeks. Time lost its shape, becoming a shapeless mass of waiting. Waiting for a letter, a visit, a sign. Waiting for anything that would tell her she still existed, that she was still his. But the world went silent. No note, no news, no scent of her in the air. Only emptiness. An emptiness that echoed louder than any scream, and he began to believe that maybe this silence was the new normal. A normal one without her. A normal. One that hurt everywhere at once. The days began to slip by like lukewarm water. All the same, tasteless, without direction. He woke up, ate mechanically, went to school, came back, went to bed. Nothing held him, nothing clearly hurt. It was like living wrapped in thick cotton that muffled sounds, colors, smells, and feelings. Sometimes he looked at his own hands as if they weren't his, as if he were lending his body to someone else to live in his place. The child who used to laugh loudly, make up stories, and run barefoot through the yard seemed to have stayed back there in the courtroom, along with the words he'd spoken. Silence swallowed her, and now only an empty boy remained. He began collecting memories of her like one would collect seashells, small, fragile, and with the sound of the past trapped within. A handkerchief forgotten at the bottom of a drawer, an old photo of her smiling with crooked teeth, a loose button from her coat that he found under the bed. He kept everything in a cardboard box hidden in the wardrobe. At night he would open the box and spread the objects on the floor, creating a kind of silent altar. He touched each item with light fingers, as if afraid they would fall apart, and tried to remember the sound of her voice, the warmth of her embrace, the smell of soap on clean clothes. It was the closest he could get to her now. Meanwhile, the world seemed to want to move on, as if nothing had happened. The teacher went back to giving homework. His classmates went back to running around the playground. His neighbors went back to watering plants and discussing tomato prices. This left him confused and furious at the same time. How could everyone just carry on? How could the sun still rise if his universe had ended? Sometimes he felt like screaming in the middle of the classroom just to remind people that he still existed, that there was a war going on inside him, but the scream wouldn't come out. It stayed stuck in his chest, burning, and he swallowed it back down, as he did with everything. He began to fear oblivion, afraid that as the days passed, his mother would also fade from his mind, like a chalk drawing erased by the rain. So he began repeating her name in his mind before sleeping, like a prayer. He also wrote short phrases in his school notebooks, not about her directly, but things she said, like "those who love care," or "life sometimes just wants us to move on." It was his way of keeping her alive within the routines of a world that seemed intent on erasing her. Each written letter was an attempt to resist oblivion, like someone trying to hold sand between their fingers. But the longing began to turn into something else. At first it was just absence. Then it turned into pain. Now it was starting to turn into fear. Fear that her absence would become the new normal. Fear that I would wake up one day and no longer remember her voice. Fear that if I kept growing, I would eventually become someone who no longer missed her. And that felt like the worst form of betrayal. So I began to observe people on the street, looking for traces of her in other women. The way they fixed their hair, the way they smiled with their eyes, the way they tilted their head when listening. Sometimes I thought I caught a glimpse of her and ran, but it was always someone else, and each mistake hurt, as if I had lost her all over again. Hurt, as if I had lost her all over again. The nights were the worst. The silence of the empty house seemed to grow after sunset, filling the hallways and his chest. He lay and listened to his own heartbeat, slow and heavy like a distant drum. He thought about the courtroom the last time he saw her, the light touch of her hand in his hair, her trembling smile. He thought about the words he'd said, the ones he hadn't, the ones he wished he could pluck from the air. Sometimes he'd get up in the middle of the night and go to the door just to see if, by some miracle, she'd be there. She never was. But he kept trying, because stopping trying felt like giving up on her altogether, and that he couldn't bear. Over time, he began to realize he was changing inside. I couldn't say how, but I knew it was different. He laughed less, spoke less, felt less. Everything seemed to happen at a safe distance, as if life were passing by on the other side of thick glass. He no longer allowed himself to hope for anything good, because hoping hurt and hurting again seemed dangerous. He became careful with his feelings, like someone carrying crystals in a straw basket. His childhood, the part that believed love was enough for everything, seemed to have been ripped out like a tooth without anesthesia. And in its place was a hollow space that silence effortlessly filled. Sometimes I'd take the box of memories out into the backyard at dusk. I'd sit on the cold earth, spread out the objects, and watch the sky change color, wondering if she saw the same sky from wherever she was. It was the only moment of the day he allowed himself to feel something resembling hope. Not a big, bright hope, just a tiny, fragile, stubborn spark. A hope that didn't promise she'd return, only that maybe, just maybe, she still thought of him too. And that was what kept him breathing one day at a time, even though inside he was still stuck in the courtroom. He didn't know it yet, but that silence wasn't the end. It was just the gap between who he had been and who he would be forced to become after all. The invisible marks as the weeks passed, something curious began to happen. On the outside, he seemed better. He started doing his homework again, answering his teacher's questions and even cracking small smiles every now and then. The adults were relieved, saying he was getting over it. But it wasn't overcoming, it was a disguise. A disguise he donned every morning like putting on a heavy coat. He learned to mimic expressions, tones of voice, reactions. He learned to look good. But inside it was as if he'd cracked into 1,000 pieces that remained in place only out of habit. And each fake smile was a fragile glue holding the shards together for another day. The marks the trial left weren't on his scraped knees or small hands. They were in the dark corners of his mind, where no one looked. They were in the way he flinched when someone spoke loudly, in the way he analyzed every face before trusting, in the way he watched doors as if calculating escape routes. Children tend to believe the world is a safe place until someone proves otherwise, and the world had brutally proven that, so he lived on constant alert, even in quiet places, even in calm moments, as if expecting that at any moment another earthquake would rip away what was left of him. The guilt remained too, silent but present like a constant hum. It appeared in the simplest moments, when he laughed at a joke, when he received a compliment, when the sun hit his face and he felt a moment of peace. In those moments, the guilt would whisper that he had no right to be happy while she was away. That happiness would be oblivion and forgetting would be betrayal. So he stifled the smiles, extinguished the sparkles before they could grow. It was like living with a weight tied to his chest, pulling everything back down, a weight made of words he couldn't say, of hugs he couldn't give, of everything he'd choked up on the day of the trial. He began developing strange little habits, like counting his steps between rooms or aligning objects on the table with obsessive perfection. If anyone disturbed them, he'd silently put them back, his eyes dark. It wasn't a mania, it was control. After experiencing an event where everything spiraled out of control, he needed to believe he could still control something, even if it was the placement of his pencils or the order of his socks in the drawer. It was his way of saying to chaos, "Not here." Adults thought he was just meticulous, perhaps even intelligent for his age. No one realized it was fear disguised as organization. His body also began to bear the scars. He had headaches that came out of nowhere, an upset stomach even when he wasn't sick, and shoulders that were always tense as if carrying an invisible backpack. He slept little and poorly, waking several times with the feeling that someone was calling him. Sometimes he would go to the bedroom door and stand there, hoping the call was real. It wasn't. But he kept waiting because part of him still believed that if he paid enough attention, he could prevent further losses. He didn't understand that loss doesn't ask for permission, it just enters. And it was this lack of warning that left the deepest scar. The people around him saw none of this. They only saw the quiet, obedient boy, too polite for his age. And they praised him. They told him he was strong, that he was recovering, that he was an example. Each compliment was like salt on a hidden cut. Because he knew it wasn't strength, it was fear. Fear of disappointing, fear of failing again, fear that if he wasn't perfect, someone would take him away. So he tried to please everyone. He got good grades, didn't complain, didn't cry, didn't ask for anything. He became a polite ghost, floating through routines with light steps so as not to disturb the world. The cruelest thing was that even so young, he knew he was different. He felt it when he looked at the other children. They ran, screamed, fell, and got up laughing. He watched them with a mixture of tenderness and strangeness, like someone seeing a language they no longer speak. Sometimes he wanted to scream along, but the scream wouldn't come. He felt like if he screamed instead of sound, shards would come out. So he stayed quiet, with that restrained smile that adults found beautiful but which hid the emptiness. The happy boy he had been seemed like a friend who had moved to another city without warning. And he had stayed behind, packing away the toys he no longer knew how to use. At night, the invisible scars spoke louder. Lying in bed, he felt a hole in his chest where the certainty of being loved had once resided. Now that certainty seemed like a forgotten dream. He stared at the ceiling, trying to remember his mother's face smiling without sadness, and the memory came back blurry like a photograph left in the sun. This terrified him more than anything, the idea that time would erase even her. So he closed his eyes tightly and mentally replayed the good scenes. Her making pancakes, her combing his hair, her laughing when he got paint on her. He repeated them like someone reciting spells to ward off monsters. Only the monster now was oblivion. And so, without realizing it, the boy began to transform into a silent version of himself. A keeper of memories, a collector of absences, a survivor of a shipwreck no one knew had happened. People said he was better, but he knew he wasn't better. He was just more invisible. And invisible, no one bleeds. Over time, he began to avoid attachments. It wasn't out of malice, it was self-protection. When someone at school tried to get too close, he'd take a step back, make excuses, hide behind silence. He was afraid of forming bonds and then losing them, as happened with her. In his mind, love was synonymous with risk, and risk now was intolerable. So he preferred to be alone. Loneliness hurt, but it was a familiar, predictable pain that didn't surprise. And he desperately needed predictability. The other kids saw him as weird, but he didn't care. It was safer to be weird than to be torn apart again. This distance even affected the way he viewed adults. Before he saw them as wise giants who knew what they were doing. Now he saw them as unpredictable creatures, capable of promising safety and then ripping it away without warning. The judge, the prosecutors, the police, they all claimed to be doing the right thing, but the right thing had taken his mother away and left him alone. This contradiction stuck within him like a thorn. He began to listen with suspicion to any speech from authority, as if expecting a trap behind every order. Adults became dangerous enigmas, and he became an expert at not trusting. He began to observe everything and everyone as if he were constantly preparing for disaster. He noticed the slightest changes in people's tone of voice, their looks, their postures. If someone appeared more serious, he was already bracing himself for bad news. If someone whispered, he was certain they were talking about him. This constant state of alert exhausted him, but he believed it was necessary to survive. It was as if he lived in a minefield and could only walk by carefully planning his steps. People praised his maturity, but in reality it was fear. Fear of stepping in the wrong place and watching the world fall apart again. The scars also began to show in the way he thought about himself. Before he'd believed he was just an ordinary boy, now he saw himself as damaged. He wouldn't say it out loud, but he carried the idea that there was something broken inside him, something no one saw, but that made him less than others. When he messed up an assignment or forgot a piece of material at school, he heard an inner voice say, "Of course you did. You ruin everything." It was the same voice that whispered at night that he'd destroyed his own mother. This voice grew like ivy, tangling itself around his thoughts until he began to believe it might be true. And because he believed he was flawed, he began to feel unworthy of the good things that still came his way. If someone complimented him, he would shrug and change the subject. If he received a gift, he would hide it, as if he weren't worthy of possessing beautiful things. If someone said they liked him, he would laugh awkwardly and not believe them. He thought that if people saw who he really was, the boy who had betrayed his mother, they would immediately distance themselves. So he began to hide what he felt, what he thought, what he wanted. He became an expert at disappearing in plain sight. He was always there, but never completely. Sometimes, in those rare moments of courage, he imagined what it would be like to tell someone everything he'd experienced. He thought about saying, "I was just a child and they made me choose between love and justice." But he gave up before even trying. I thought no one would understand, that adults would downplay it, saying he did the right thing, or that he was just a boy, it wasn't his fault. But he felt guilty, and being told he shouldn't feel that way only made him feel more isolated. So he bottled it all up as he always had. And what's kept inside for too long begins to become part of the structure, like rusty beams that support a house even when it's corroded. Childhood continued to pass outside, but he was no longer part of it. The games of others sounded like echoes of a forgotten language. Instead of running, he would draw in silence, always the same patterns, doors, keys, bars. His teacher thought it was curious, saying it might be artistic talent. But it wasn't art, it was memory. It was his mind trying to shape the invisible prisons he carried inside. Doors that closed in the courtroom. Keys he never had. Bars no one saw, but which were there, firm, holding who he was hostage to who he had become. Holding who he was hostage to who he had become. The most painful thing was knowing that no one would ever fully understand, because the marks he bore didn't bleed, didn't make a sound, didn't attract attention. They were invisible marks, but they shaped every thought, every gesture, every fear. While others saw a quiet, well-behaved boy, he knew he was walking on sharp pieces, and each step was measured, calculated, painful, not because he wanted to, but because he no longer knew how to walk any other way. And so, without anyone noticing, the trauma stopped being an episode and became architecture, and he, at 7 years old, was already a survivor disguised as a child. When he grew up, time passed, but it didn't take away what had happened. It simply buried it deep enough for others to think it was gone. He grew up silently as if he didn't want to attract attention. He became a reserved teenager, with light steps and a watchful gaze, always calculating the invisible risks of every gesture. His classmates said he was too mature, his teachers said he was centered. But no one knew that this precocious maturity wasn't a virtue, it was a scar. It was the result of having known ruin before he even lost his baby teeth. It was the way he found to continue existing without collapsing. In his youth, he developed the habit of observing people before trusting them. He didn't easily believe in sweet words, compliments, or promises. He thought everything could turn to dust overnight, as happened to her. The relationships he had were brief and superficial. When someone tried to get too close, he would gently but firmly pull away, like closing a door carefully so as not to make a sound. He would say it wasn't the right time, that he needed to focus on his studies, his work, his life. But the truth is, he was afraid of getting attached and losing again, afraid of loving and watching the world mercilessly rip it away from him. The frightened boy in court became an organized, impeccable, productive, and emotionally absent man. He was the kind of person everyone saw as trustworthy, but no one truly knew. He knew how to listen, how to advise, how to console, but rarely allowed himself to be consoled. He carried his own ghost discreetly, like someone hiding scars under expensive clothes. At work, he was praised for his calm. No one knew that this calm was just a disguise trained since childhood, a glass mask covering a rough sea. He learned to control every gesture, every tone of voice, every word, like an actor who never breaks character, because breaking out would be dangerous. It might reveal the broken boy who still lived inside. Memories of his mother came in disconnected flashes, like sparks in the dark. Sometimes, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, I'd smell soap and remember the backyard tank. Sometimes I'd hear a laugh like hers and my chest would tighten so much I had to sit down. He never saw her again after the trial. He didn't know if she'd served her time, if she'd gotten out, if she'd rebuilt her life, if she'd thought about him. Part of him wanted to know. Part preferred not to find out. He was afraid to meet her and see in her eyes confirmation of what he'd feared since he was 7, that she'd never forgiven him. So he chose not to know. It was a kind of protection, because if he didn't know, he could still imagine that maybe she loved him. The guilt grew old with him. It was no longer that high-pitched scream of childhood. Now it was a constant low hum that silently accompanied him. Sometimes when he did something good, receiving an award, signing an important contract, buying something he wanted, The guilt would appear like a shadow. You shouldn't be happy. She can't be. Then he would slow his pace, his smile, his pride. It was as if he lived with a handbrake pulled inside his chest. He never allowed himself complete joy because he felt he didn't deserve it. As if, by betraying his mother, he had signed an invisible contract that forbade him from being fully happy. He also developed a strange obsession with control. He needed to plan every detail of his life, as if he could avoid catastrophes if he predicted everything in advance. The house was impeccably organized, his work always completed ahead of schedule, his routine timed. People praised this discipline, but they didn't realize it was fear disguised as efficiency. Because deep down he believed that chaos was always lurking, and that if he let his guard down, the world would come back to take away what he loved. So he lived armed with spreadsheets, lists, and goals as if they were walls. But even surrounded by perfect structures, he still felt fragile inside, like thin glass about to crack. Loneliness became a familiar place. Not exactly comfortable, but familiar. He liked being with people, but he didn't like to give himself away. When he met friends, he was always kind, attentive, but he kept a piece of himself hidden, inaccessible, a piece no one had touched since he was 7. Sometimes he envied the lightness of others, the way they allowed themselves to trust, love, believe. He no longer knew how to do that. Childhood had taught him that love doesn't save, and now the adult he had become lived as if loving always meant putting a rope around his own neck. So he preferred not to risk it, because deep down he was still the boy on the bench, holding words like weapons that could kill. The nights continued to be the territory where ghosts roamed free. He slept little and poorly, with dreams that mixed together fragments of the past. His mother's gaze, the judge's gavel, the sound of scratching pens, the bench too high for his feet to reach the floor. Sometimes he woke with a dry throat and wet eyes, unsure if he'd cried in his sleep. He'd sit on the edge of the bed, his face in his hands, and wait for his heart to slow. Then he'd stand up and look in the mirror, and was always surprised by how whole he looked on the outside. Because on the inside, he still had days when he felt 7 years old and a wreck. Despite everything, there was something resilient in him. A stubborn flame that wouldn't go out. Perhaps that's why he'd become so careful with others, especially children. Whenever he saw a child sad, he'd sit beside them, offering silence, listening, presence, everything he himself lacked. Perhaps it was an unconscious attempt to save others to compensate for his failure to save his mother. Perhaps it was just raw empathy, born of suffering. But there was a sweetness in him, even if hidden beneath layers of invisible armor, a sweetness that proved the boy from before still existed, just buried. Still, he never spoke about what happened. Not with friends, not with colleagues, not with anyone. It was like a locked book no one knew existed. He kept that day inside him like someone keeping a body at the bottom of a lake. Silent, forgotten on the surface, but weighing eternally down below. Sometimes he thought about telling someone, just to see if it would ease his feelings, but he always gave up, because he was afraid that if he spoke, it would all come back. The looks, the questions, the court, his mother leaving. So he remained silent, and the silence, which had once been a shield, became a prison. An elegant, well-decorated prison, but a prison nonetheless, and that's how he lived. Functional on the outside, fragmented on the inside, a man built on the rubble of a boy who just wanted his mother back. As the years passed, he began to realize that the past didn't stay quiet forever. He could bury it beneath routines, achievements, rehearsed smiles, but it would return, sometimes in small bursts, sometimes like a silent earthquake. It would return when he heard children laughing freely, when he saw mothers hugging their children, when someone mentioned courts on the news. At those times, the world around him became noise, and he was 7 years old again, feet dangling in the air, throat dry, her eyes begging him to say nothing. No one noticed these internal falls. He remained standing, responding, smiling. Only he knew he was falling apart inside. He began to have strange lapses, moments when he lost track of what he was doing because his mind was far away, stuck in the past. Once during a work meeting, he realized he'd been staring into space for minutes, his pen poised in midair, his mind filled with the scent of his mother's backyard soap. Another time in a supermarket, he saw a woman with the same dark hair and froze in the cereal aisle, his heart racing, his eyes welling up. By the time he blinked, the woman had already turned the corner, and he stood there feeling like he'd just lost someone again. They were brief lapses, but they left a bitter taste that lingered for hours. At night, the memories came without asking permission. Sometimes he dreamed he was back in the courtroom, and everything was the same, except this time he remained silent and she smiled and walked away holding his hand. He woke crying with a brief relief that quickly turned to guilt. Other times he dreamed she returned but said nothing, just looked at him with a hard, sad look and then turned and disappeared. These dreams left him exhausted, as if he had run miles in his sleep. He began to sleep less and less, fearing what he might encounter with his eyes closed. Gradually, he realized he was trapped in a strange cycle. He was constantly trying to be flawless, to make up for what he believed he had accomplished. But perfection was never enough. Whenever he achieved something, he felt for a moment that perhaps he was redeeming himself. And then the inner voice would come telling him that nothing would erase that day. It was like trying to fill a hole with wind. This made him work too hard, study too hard, help too much. He wanted to be needed, indispensable, as if that could guarantee that no one would abandon him. But behind this dedication was dread, a dread of being seen as disposable, as he believes he was seen when they let his mother go. Let his mother go. I didn't understand, but he was still living at 7. Only now he had an adult body to hide it. And the world seemed satisfied with the facade, the dedicated professional, the trustworthy friend, the polite neighbor. No one asked what lay beneath. No one suspected the boy screaming inside him, still trapped on the courtroom bench, still holding words like knives. Sometimes he wondered if anyone would ever truly know him, and the silent answer hurt maybe not. Because to be known you would have to tell, and telling would be to reopen the lake where that part of his life had sunk. And he didn't know if he would survive that again. But despite the fear, something began to change. Little by little, she felt the urge to write. She began with loose sentences in forgotten notebooks, then long passages in secret files on her computer. She didn't write directly about her mother. She wrote about silent boys, about shadowy courts, about adults who demand truths from children. Each word seemed to lift a bit of the weight from her chest. It wasn't redemption, but it was a breath of fresh air, like opening a crack in a stuffy room. She realized that perhaps telling her story didn't mean destroying herself. Perhaps it was the only chance to rebuild what was left. It was frightening, but also liberating. As if for the first time she were opening the door to the cell she carried inside. Even so, he continued to fear forgiveness. Not hers, his own. Forgiving himself seemed dangerous, as if it meant forgetting her. As if by alleviating the guilt he erased the love. So he carried both together, love and guilt, like two stones in his pockets. He learned to walk despite the weight. He learned to smile despite the emptiness. He learned to live even without knowing if he deserved it. It was what he knew how to do, survive. Only now he began to suspect that perhaps he could do more than that. Perhaps he could truly live, not just resist. And that thought frightened and exhilarated him at the same time, like the edge of a dive. Deep down, he knew he would never be the boy he once was. That childhood was buried in the courtroom, along with the naive trust that love was enough. But maybe he could be something else now. Not a survivor, but someone whole, even with the cracks. Someone who accepted that scars aren't shame, they're maps. And maybe, just maybe, he could one day look back and see that boy not as his mother's betrayer, but as the boy who did the impossible to survive the impossible. And on that day, perhaps I would finally be able to say out loud what had been bottled up for so many years. I just wanted her to stay. The weight children shouldn't carry. How many children do you know who are smiling, but maybe carrying a world that doesn't even fit adults? How many times have you looked at someone strong without imagining how many broken pieces they hide behind their silence? This boy survived, but he left his childhood on the court bench. And the truth is, when we force a child to choose between love and justice, neither survives whole. Maybe the question isn't what did he do, but where were the adults who should have protected him from having to do it? Now, I want to know from you, do you believe a child can heal from a wound like that? And how many stories like this are still happening silently around us while we pretend not to see? If this made you think, share your feelings in the comments. And if you want to continue reflecting on real, deep and human stories like this, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Because silence has already taken too long. And here, we choose to listen. Listen.